Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you're here tonight. Settle in wherever you are. Maybe you're listening from your bed, maybe from the quiet corner of a room where the day has finally stopped asking things from you, maybe from a kitchen table with one small light on and the rest of the house already turning still. Tonight we're going to a place that does not look dangerous at first. Not a battlefield, not a mine shaft, not a storm at sea. We're going upstairs. That is all. Up through a building in New York City, past the noise of the street, past the push carts and the carriages and the Saturday crowds, up to the top floors of a garment factory where young women sit shoulder to shoulder and make the clothing that modern America is beginning to wear. And here is the thing that will stay with you once you know it. The danger was not hidden in some mysterious place. It was in the ordinary details. A door, a staircase, a waste bin full of fabric scraps. A fire escape that looked like safety until the moment it was asked to become safety. The Triangle Waste Company occupied the upper floors of the Ash Building near Washington Square, and on Saturday, March 25th, 1911, a fire broke out near closing time. Within minutes, 146 workers were dead, most of them young immigrant women and girls. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from tonight? What time is it where you are? Is the room around you bright, or have you let it go dim for a while? I ask because this story, more than many others, has a way of making ordinary rooms feel different. The chair you're sitting in, the window near you, the door you could walk through if you needed to leave. We almost never think about escape until escape becomes the only thing that matters. And if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you like history told slowly, with the human details left in, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when something in the story makes you pause. Do it when you feel that quiet pull of the past reaching into the present. And if you want to leave a comment telling me where you are watching from, I genuinely love reading those. Now, let us go back to New York City in 1911, to a Saturday afternoon when the work week was almost finished, and to a locked door above Washington Place. The first thing to understand is that the Triangle Fire did not begin as a strange event. It began in the middle of normal life. That may be the most unsettling part of it. The workers had not come to the factory that morning expecting to become part of American history. They came because rent was due, because food cost money, because younger brothers and sisters needed shoes, because families who had crossed an ocean did not survive in New York by resting. The city in those years was packed with people trying to turn labour into a future. Jewish immigrants from Russia, Poland and other parts of Eastern Europe, Italian immigrants from the south of Italy and Sicily, girls who had arrived as children and learned English from the streets faster than their parents did, girls who still spoke Yiddish or Italian at home, girls who were 14, 15, 16, with adult hands and child faces, earning wages that could help hold an entire household together. The Triangle Factory made shirtwaists, which were blouses worn by women across the country, popular because they looked clean, practical, modern and respectable. They were the kind of garment that belonged to a new age, an age of office workers, department stores, streetcars, and women moving through the city with a little more freedom than their grandmothers had known. There is something almost cruel in that contrast. A shirtwaist could look like independence on the woman who bought it. It could suggest motion, modernity, a life outside the parlour. But the hands that made it often belonged to women whose own lives were hemmed in by the clock, the foreman, the pay envelope, and the speed of the machine. The Triangle Waist Company was one of the largest blouse makers in New York. It was not some hidden backroom shop with 2 machines and a crooked sign. It was a major operation, occupying the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, a modern structure for its time, tall and solid-looking, with big windows that let light pour across the workrooms. From the outside, it did not look like a trap. That is important. Disasters do not always announce themselves by looking shabby. Sometimes they sit inside buildings that pass inspection, buildings that seem strong, buildings that people enter every morning because everyone else is entering too. Think about what it meant to work that high above the street in 1911. The city below was alive all day, but up in the factory the workers lived inside another rhythm. Machines rattled, belts moved, needles rose and fell so quickly they seemed less like tools than insects. Fabric moved from hand to hand. The air held lint, thread dust, heat, and the smell of bodies working close together. Long tables ran across the floors, cut fabric piled up, finished garments were bundled, scraps gathered in bins and under tables, because shirtwaist production created waste by the pound. Little pieces of cotton lawn and muslin and lace and paper patterns, all of it dry, light and ready to burn. Workers were paid by the piece or under systems that rewarded speed, which meant the room itself seemed to urge them faster. Faster stitching, faster trimming, faster finishing, because a few cents here and there mattered. It mattered if you were bringing money home to a tenement apartment where every dollar had already been imagined before it arrived. Now, I want you to sit with the height of that building for a moment. 10 stories does not sound impossible to us. Modern cities have made us casual about height. We ride elevators without thinking. We look out of windows from hotel rooms and offices and apartment towers and trust that the building knows what it is doing. But in 1911, for a factory full of workers, height changed everything. A fire on a lower floor was one kind of danger. A fire on the 8th, 9th, or 10th floor was another. Firefighters could come quickly, and they did come quickly. Horses could pull engines through the streets, men could raise ladders. Hoses could be unrolled, but the ladders of the New York Fire Department at that time could not reach the upper floors where so many Triangle workers were trapped, and the safety nets used below were not strong enough to save people falling from that height. Here is where the story becomes harder, because the word trapped can sound simple until you ask what trapped actually meant. It meant that a person could see daylight and still not reach safety. It meant that a window could be open and still be a dead end. It meant that a stairway could be only a few steps away but blocked by smoke, flame, bodies, or a door that would not open. Some doors in the Triangle factory were locked or difficult to use, a practice tied to management's fear of theft and unauthorized breaks, and other exits opened the wrong way for a panicked crowd pressing forward. Olsher's historical account notes locked doors. Doors opening the wrong way, only a few buckets of water, a collapsed fire escape, and long tables and bulky machines that made escape more difficult. A locked door is such a small object until it is not. Most of the time, a locked door is just a detail. It protects property, it marks a boundary, it keeps order. In the mind of an owner, it can seem reasonable. Workers come in here, workers leave there, bags are checked, time is controlled, fabric does not disappear. The day runs more smoothly when the doors obey the rules of the business. But a door has two meanings, and those meanings are not equal. To the owner, it may mean control. To the worker, in the wrong moment, it may mean death. That is the terrible lesson sitting at the centre of this story. The Triangle fire was not only about flame. It was about all the decisions made before the flame, decisions that seemed ordinary enough when business was good and the machines were running and the profits were counted. The door was locked before the fire, the scraps were there before the fire, the fire escape was weak before the fire, the workers were crowded before the fire, the ladders were too short before the fire. Disaster did not invent those facts, it revealed them, and this is why we cannot begin with the fire alone. We have to begin with the room as it was before the first alarm, because that is where the truth lives. Picture the 8th floor late on a Saturday afternoon. The week is almost done. Saturday is not yet the leisure day it would become for many Americans later. For these workers, Saturday is still a work day, and the work day has been long. Some of the women are already thinking about the evening, maybe a walk with friends, maybe a union meeting, maybe errands before Sunday. Maybe nothing but going home, eating, helping with younger children, and sleeping hard because the body does not negotiate with exhaustion. The factory is full of ordinary end-of-day thoughts. A girl may be watching the clock. Another may be trying to finish one last piece before the day ends. Someone may be annoyed with a foreman. Someone may be hungry. Someone may be laughing quietly in a language her supervisor does not understand. Someone may be thinking about the coins she expects to receive, already dividing them in her mind between rent, bread, coal, and maybe one tiny thing for herself. That is another detail worth holding. These were not symbols to themselves. They were not victims of industrial capitalism in their own minds as they sat at the machines, though history would later need language like that to explain what happened to them. They were people in the middle of errands, jokes, complaints, ambitions, and ordinary fatigue. Some had survived pogroms or poverty in Europe. Some had crossed the Atlantic in steerage. Some had learned to navigate New York streets while still children. Some were engaged. Some were daughters whose mothers waited at home. Some were sisters supporting brothers in school. They lived in neighbourhoods where the sounds of work came through walls, where pushcart vendors called from the street, where laundry hung between buildings, where the smell of cooking mixed with coal smoke and damp stairwells. They were part of the city's hidden machinery, the human machinery beneath the shine of the new century. The owners of Triangle, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were not unusual men in the world they inhabited. That may be part of the discomfort. It is easier to tell history when villains are monsters, when they stand outside the ordinary habits of their time. But Blank and Harris were businessmen in a fiercely competitive garment industry, and many businessmen of that world treated fire risk, worker discomfort, locked exits, and crowded rooms as costs to be balanced against production. They had known labour conflict. They had faced striking workers. The garment industry had already been shaken by the Great Shirtwaist Strike of 1909, often called the Uprising of the 20,000, when thousands of mostly young women garment workers walked out demanding better pay, shorter hours, and safer conditions. Triangle workers had been part of that larger struggle, and the strike had shown the city something it did not always want to see. Young immigrant women, dismissed by many as powerless, could organise, march, endure arrests, and refuse to be invisible. But reform does not move at the speed of suffering. That is one of the hardest truths in history. People can complain for years before anyone listens. Workers can describe danger again and again, and still the danger remains because the danger is profitable, or convenient, or legally permissible, or simply normal. Normal is one of the most dangerous words in the past. It can cover almost anything. Normal meant children working. Normal meant 12-hour days in some trades. Normal meant women searched before leaving work. Normal meant doors controlled from the outside. Normal meant fire drills were not treated as sacred obligations. Normal meant that if you were poor, your body absorbed risks that wealthier people never had to name. Let us stay with that word normal, because the Triangle Fire changed American work precisely because it made normal unbearable to look at. Before the fire, many people knew factory conditions were dangerous. Reformers knew, workers knew, unions knew, some journalists knew, families knew when daughters came home with tired eyes and aching backs. But knowledge can remain scattered. It can stay private, neighbourhood by neighbourhood, shop by shop, complaint by complaint. A mother can know her daughter is working in a dangerous place, but what can she do if that wage keeps the family fed? A worker can know the exit is locked, but what can she do if speaking up means losing her job? A city can know that thousands of people work in unsafe buildings, but as long as those buildings do not burn in front of a crowd, the knowing remains soft. It does not yet have a public shape. On March 25th, 1911, the knowing became visible. That is why this story entered American memory. Not only because 146 people died, though that number is terrible enough. Not only because many were young women and girls, though that fact pierced the city deeply. It remained because the deaths happened in public, above a busy neighbourhood, in front of witnesses who could not look away. People on the sidewalk saw workers appear at the windows. They saw smoke behind them. They saw choices no human being should be forced to make. They saw what it meant when a workplace had no real path out. And once a crowd has seen that, the city cannot easily return to pretending that danger is an abstract matter, best left to owners, inspectors, and insurance men. One of the witnesses nearby was Frances Perkins, then a young reformer having tea not far from Washington Square. She heard the commotion and reached the scene as the disaster unfolded, and the memory of Triangle stayed with her for the rest of her life. She would later become the first woman to serve in a United States presidential cabinet as Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt, and she connected her life's work in labor reform to what she had seen that day. I want to be careful with the word changed. History rarely turns on one event in the simple way we sometimes want it to. The Triangle Fire did not instantly make American workplaces safe. It did not end exploitation. It did not bring back the dead. It did not suddenly make every employer humane or every law strong. But it did something powerful. It gave reform a moral force that could not be dismissed as theory. After the fire, New York created the Factory Investigating Commission, which examined industrial working conditions and helped drive major changes in labour and fire safety law. The US Department of Labor's historical account describes the fire as the beginning point for that commission's work, investigating crowded and unsafe workplaces and pushing reforms that reached far beyond one factory. But before the hearings, before the laws, before the speeches, before the memorials, there was still that room. There were still the young women at the tables. There was still a Saturday afternoon with the light coming through the windows. I keep returning to that because it is easy, from a distance, to let the story become only a lesson. We say Triangle changed workplace safety. We say Triangle galvanized reform. We say Triangle became a turning point in American labor history. All of that is true. But the people inside the factory did not die to become a turning point. They did not wake up that morning to teach the country a lesson. They were making blouses. They were counting wages. They were thinking about supper. They were waiting for the end of the day. And maybe that is what makes the locked door so hard to think about. It was not dramatic until the fire came. It was part of a system of small humiliations and controls that many workers had been expected to accept. A locked exit says something even when there is no emergency. It says your movement belongs to someone else. It says suspicion is built into the architecture. It says the cloth matters, the schedule matters, the output matters, and your freedom to leave is conditional. In ordinary hours, that message is degrading. In a fire, it becomes fatal. Now let's imagine the building from the street before anything has gone wrong. The Ash Building stands at the corner of Washington Place and Green Street. Students and residents move through the neighbourhood. Washington Square is nearby, with its arch and its open space, a place that can feel almost gentle compared with the factory districts farther downtown. The building rises above the street with a confidence typical of the period, part of a city growing upward because land is expensive and ambition has learned to climb. Inside, elevators carry people to the upper floors. Stairways twist through the building. A fire escape clings to the outside, thin and insufficient. The factory floors are high enough that the workers can look out over the city, but that view is not freedom. A view is only a view unless you can leave. There is a strange intimacy to workplace history, because it asks us to look at things we still understand with our own bodies. Most of us know what it means to watch a clock at work. Most of us know the feeling of a room where the air has gone stale, where the day is almost over but not quite. We know what it means to be tired and still expected to pay attention. We know the small relief that comes when closing time is close enough to feel real. And because we know those things, we can approach these workers not as distant figures in black and white photographs, but as people inhabiting a familiar human rhythm. The end of a workday has always had its own kind of mercy. The body begins leaving before the feet do. You start thinking about the street, the door, the way home. You gather yourself inwardly. That is what many of them were doing when the first sign of fire appeared. The cause of the fire has often been linked to a spark or discarded match or cigarette igniting scraps, though the exact beginning remains uncertain. What matters for this opening moment is how ready the room was to burn. Cotton fabric, tissue paper patterns, wooden tables, bins of clippings, air moving through a crowded workroom. A factory can look like order when everything is still, piles in their places, machines in rows, workers at assigned stations. But fire reads a room differently than people do. Fire does not see production. It sees fuel. It sees pathways. It sees the waste bin not as a housekeeping problem, but as an invitation. It sees a locked door not as a management rule, but as time stolen from the living. When the alarm came, there was no long warning. That is another modern misunderstanding we sometimes bring to the past. We imagine there is time because stories take time to tell. We imagine danger unfolding at the speed of narration. But fire in a room like that moves faster than comprehension. First there is confusion, then recognition, then movement, a shout, a chair knocked back, a machine abandoned, someone running toward a stairway, someone reaching for a bucket. Someone trying to understand whether this is small enough to fight or large enough to flee. A few seconds can contain an entire change in the world. Before the fire, you're a worker near the end of a shift. After the fire, you're a body searching for air, light, space, and a door that opens. I want to leave you in that suspended moment for now, not because the rest is less important, but because it is important enough not to rush. The story of Triangle is often told through its most horrifying images, and we will not look away from those when the time comes. But if we begin only with the windows and the fall, we miss the quieter history that made those moments possible. We miss the young women walking to work that morning. We miss the sewing machines and the pay envelopes. We miss the owners and the inspectors and the laws that had not yet been written. We miss the locked door before anyone was trapped behind it. And that is where the real story begins, not with flame, but with a country that had grown comfortable letting people work in rooms where escape depended on luck. So stay with me as we move deeper into this building and into the lives of the girls and women who filled it. Before the smoke, before the screams from the windows, before the crowd below understood what it was seeing, there was a garment industry built on speed, youth, immigration, hunger, and hope. There were hands guiding white cloth under needles, making neat seams for women who would never know their names. There were families in tenement rooms depending on wages earned one stitch at a time. There was an America being dressed by workers it barely saw. And to understand what burned on Washington Place, we have to understand who was sitting at those machines when the ordinary workday began. Before there was fire, there was cloth. That is where we have to begin. Not with smoke at the windows, not with sirens in the street, not with the crowd looking up from Washington Place, but with cloth moving through young hands all day long. White cloth, light cloth, the kind used for shirtwaists, the blouses that had become part of the uniform of modern womanhood in the early 1900s. If you have ever buttoned a shirt without thinking about who made the seam, or pulled a sleeve over your arm without thinking about the person who guided that fabric under a needle, then you already understand something about the invisibility at the centre of this story. Clothing is one of the most intimate things labour produces, and yet the labour itself disappears almost completely. It touches the body of the buyer every day, while the maker remains unknown. In New York in 1911, thousands of girls and women spent their lives inside that disappearance. They cut, stitched, trimmed, pressed, folded and bundled garments that would be worn by women who might never imagine the heat of the room where those garments began. The shirtwaist itself looked simple. That was part of its appeal. It was a blouse, usually worn with a skirt, practical enough for office work, neat enough for the street, respectable enough for women who were beginning to occupy new public spaces in American life. It belonged to the age of the typewriter, the department store, the telephone exchange, the college girl, the young woman commuting by streetcar. It suggested movement. It suggested a life that was not entirely confined to the home. There was something modern in its clean lines and high collar, something that said the world was changing and women were changing with it. But the price of that modern look was paid in workrooms where the air was close and the machines did not slow down. The garment could look crisp and free on the outside because somewhere else, someone had sat for hours doing the same motion until her shoulders ached and her eyes burned. Most of the workers in the Triangle Waist Company were young immigrant women, many of them Jewish and Italian, part of a garment industry built on the labour of families who had come to America looking for safety, wages, and some kind of future. The company was located at 23 to 29 Washington Place, near Washington Square, and Cornell's Triangle Fire Archive describes it as a typical sweated factory of the period, marked by low wages, long hours, and unsafe, unsanitary conditions. That word sweated is worth pausing over. It does not only mean hot, it means labour pressed out of the body, value drawn from exhaustion, profit made by keeping wages low and speed high. A sweatshop was not merely a messy room with sewing machines, it was an arrangement of power. It was a place where the worker had little leverage, where the employer controlled the clock, where the need to survive made refusal difficult. And for immigrant girls who were poor, young, and often still learning English, that arrangement could feel as solid as a wall. Imagine one of them leaving home in the morning. She may live on the Lower East Side in a tenement apartment where too many people share too little space. The air in the hallway may smell of coal smoke, boiled cabbage, damp wool, kerosene, and all the close odours of crowded life. Maybe she steps round children on the stairs. Maybe her mother is already awake, preparing something small before the day begins. Maybe her father is looking for work or already gone to a pushcart, a shop, a construction site, a delivery route, a trade that pays irregularly and leaves the whole household nervous. The girl going to the factory is not earning pin money. She's not working for the pleasure of independence as a modern advertisement might suggest. Her wage may help keep the family indoors. It may buy bread, rent, coal, medicine, shoes for a younger child, or the few coins needed to keep debt from spreading through the household like damp through a wall. She is young, but the money she carries home has adult weight. This is one of the first things that has to be understood honestly. Many of these girls were not children in the way the middle class like to imagine children. They had childhood years behind them, yes, but work had reached into those years early. A 14-year-old in a garment shop might already know how to bargain with a foreman, how to avoid being blamed for a mistake, how to move quickly enough to keep her place, how to hide exhaustion, how to stretch wages, how to walk through a city that could be both exciting and hostile. She might still laugh with friends on the way to work. She might still care about a ribbon, a song, a boy, a holiday, a new pair of stockings. None of that disappears because a person is poor. But beneath it all, there is the knowledge that work is not optional. In the world these families inhabited, a girl's labour could be the difference between getting by and falling. The factory did not simply employ hands, it employed time. That is what industrial work does. It gathers hours from hundreds of people, arranges those hours around machines, and turns them into goods. The worker enters in the morning and gives the day over to someone else's schedule. The bell, the foreman, the machine, the pile of unfinished pieces, all of it organises the body. Sit here, stitch this, faster, again. Do not waste thread. Do not talk too much. Do not leave before time. The garment industry in New York depended on this discipline because fashion moved quickly and competition was fierce. Orders had to be filled, contractors had to meet deadlines. Retailers wanted the newest style. Customers wanted affordable blouses. Somewhere far away from the sales floor, young women absorbed that pressure one seam at a time. Let us step inside a workroom before the fire on a day when nothing unusual happens. The first impression is noise. Not one machine, but many. A room full of sewing machines does not make a gentle sound. It clatters and trembles. The machines rise and fall with a metallic insistence that seems to enter the skull after a while. Workers sit close together because space is money. Long tables hold fabric pieces stacked and sorted. The cutters have done their part, slicing patterns into cloth, and the operators take over, guiding pieces under needles with speed that looks almost impossible to someone untrained. The floor is not clean in the way a modern workplace poster would like it to be. Thread collects, fabric scraps gather, paper patterns curl and fall, dust floats in the light from the windows. The room is bright in patches and dim in others, depending on the season, the hour, and the arrangement of tables. In winter, the windows are closed and the air grows stale. In summer, heat presses down from above and rises from bodies packed together. The work does not become easier because the weather changes. A good operator had skill. That should be said plainly, because factory labour is often described as if it required only obedience. It required obedience, certainly, but also judgment, rhythm, coordination, endurance, and practice. A seam that looks simple to the buyer may have required a worker to feed fabric evenly, under a needle at high speed, keeping edges aligned while her foot controlled the treadle or power of the machine, her hands close enough to danger that a careless moment could mean a punctured finger. Mistakes cost time, time cost money. If she was paid by the piece, slowness was not just frustrating, it reduced the wage. If she damaged cloth, the loss might be held against her. If she complained too often, there were others waiting for work. The city was full of people who needed a place at a machine, and then there were the beginners, the girls newly arrived or newly old enough to earn. They might begin with trimming threads, finishing, carrying bundles, or learning the smaller operations before moving up. Some had mothers or sisters already in the trade. Some learned from friends. Some learned by being corrected sharply until their bodies memorized what words could not teach. The factory was not only a place of exploitation, it was also a place of social life. That does not make the exploitation gentler, but it makes the history more human. Girls talked when they could. They shared food. They translated for one another. They passed along gossip, warnings, jokes, songs, union news, family news, rumours of better shops, rumours of cruel foremen, rumours of strikes. In a room designed to make them into labour, they still remained people. That is one of the stubborn facts of working-class history. Even under pressure, people create small worlds. The triangle workers were part of a broader garment world that had already begun to resist. In 1909, the shirtwaist industry in New York was shaken by the Great Strike, often remembered as the Uprising of the 20,000, when thousands of mostly women garment workers walked out demanding better conditions, better pay, shorter hours, and union recognition. Cornell's archive notes that meeting rooms and hallways filled with strikers and supporters speaking English, Italian, Yiddish, and other languages. A reminder that this was not a quiet little protest, but a mass movement crossing neighbourhoods and languages. Think about that image for a moment. Young women who had been treated as replaceable, gathered in such numbers that the rooms could not contain them. The very people dismissed as timid, foreign, poor and powerless stepped into public life and said no. One of the figures who came to represent that rising courage was Clara Lemlich, a young Jewish immigrant worker who had known the brutality of garment work herself. P.B. Essel's American Experience notes that at one shirtwaist factory where Lemlich worked, women worked 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for starting wages of $3 a week, conditions Lemlich described as reducing workers to machines. That phrase matters because it came from inside the experience. To be reduced to a machine did not mean you became emotionless. It meant the job wanted only the part of you that could repeat, produce, and continue. Your hunger, your fear, your intelligence, your family, your sore back, your dreams, your human impatience with being treated badly. All of that was supposed to be left outside the calculation. But people are not machines, and every system that forgets that eventually meets the trouble it has made. The strike was not easy. Strikes rarely are, especially for the poor. A strike means losing wages before winning anything, and that loss is immediate. Rent does not become patient because you are fighting for justice. Bread does not become cheaper because your cause is right. Many strikers were arrested. Some were beaten. Some faced hired thugs. Some families worried that daughters were becoming too bold, too public, too exposed to danger. Middle-class reformers and wealthy allies eventually brought attention and money, but the courage at the core belonged to the workers who first risked their jobs. It is important not to smooth that away. These girls did not have the luxury of symbolic protest. They risked hunger. They risked blacklisting. They risked being sent back into the same shops with owners who remembered their faces. The Triangle owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, had faced labour unrest and resisted union demands. Some firms made agreements after the strike, but Triangle remained among those that did not fully accept union recognition in the way workers had hoped. Cornell's material on the aftermath of the strike notes that while many employers conceded demands and signed agreements, Triangle was among the manufacturers that refused to recognise the union when the strike was called off. So when we talk about the girls who sewed America's clothes, we are not talking about silent figures waiting passively for tragedy. We are talking about workers already involved in a struggle over time, wages, dignity and safety. The fire would later make the whole city listen, but the workers had been speaking before the fire. The fact that not enough people listened is part of the story. There is another layer here that is easy to miss if we only say immigrant women and move on. Immigration shaped every part of their working lives. Language mattered. A girl who spoke Yiddish at home and only partial English at work had to learn not just words but rules. She had to understand instructions given quickly. She had to read danger in tone, gesture and routine. Italian workers, Jewish workers, workers from different towns and regions, all came with different customs, foods, holidays, songs, family expectations and political traditions. In the factory, they were compressed into one labour force, but outside it, they belonged to dense communities of mutual aid, newspapers, synagogues, churches, social clubs, radical meetings, family networks, and neighbourhood obligations. The Lower East Side was not simply a place of poverty, it was a world of argument and survival. Ideas moved through it: socialism, unionism, anarchism, religious tradition, American ambition, old country memory, and the practical knowledge of where to find work on Monday morning. For many families, the daughter in the factory stood between old expectations and new realities. In the old world, a young woman might have been expected to remain under close family control until marriage. In New York, wages changed the conversation. A daughter who earned money had a new importance inside the household, but not always a new freedom. Her parents might need her wage while still fearing the city's influence. The factory exposed her to men, politics, union organisers, rough language, independence, and the possibility of imagining a life not entirely arranged by others. That tension lived in many immigrant homes. Work could exploit her and enlarge her at the same time. It could exhaust her body while widening her sense of what she might become. History is often uncomfortable because both things can be true. Now picture the evening after work before the fire on an ordinary week. The girls leave the building in groups, descending from the upper floors into the city's noise. Some walk east toward the neighbourhoods where immigrant life is packed tight. Some stop to look in shop windows. Some buy a small food item from a pushcart if there is money enough. Some go straight home because there is still work waiting there. Younger children to watch, water to carry, food to prepare, laundry to help with, a mother who also looks tired. A factory girl's workday did not end when the factory closed. The wage work ended. The family work continued. In cramped apartments, daughters became interpreters, errand runners, caretakers, wage earners, and sometimes the most Americanized members of the family. They carried English home from the streets and shops. They carried old country obligations back out with them in the morning. The clothing they made travelled farther than they did. That is something worth thinking about. A shirtwaist sewn by a girl on Washington Place might be shipped, displayed, purchased, worn to an office, a lunch counter, a classroom, a train station, a church social, or a political meeting. The garment moved through the world with more ease than its maker. The buyer might admire the stitching and never know whether the operator who made it had eaten enough that day. She might see only fashion, affordability, modern style. This is how industrial capitalism hides the person inside the product. It gives the consumer an object and removes the conditions. It offers a blouse, not a room full of girls bending over machines. It offers a price tag, not the wage behind it. It offers choice to one woman and constraint to another. And yet I do not want to describe these workers only through suffering. That would flatten them in another way. They had pride. Many garment workers were proud of being skilled. They knew the difference between poor stitching and good work. They knew which shops paid better, which foremen were unbearable, which girls were fast, which ones could organise a room, which ones could make everyone laugh. They dressed carefully when they could. They took pleasure in small luxuries. Some attended dances, lectures, union meetings, theatres and neighbourhood events. Some read newspapers in Yiddish or Italian. Some dreamed of marriage. Some did not. Some wanted education. Some wanted better wages more urgently than anything else, because dreams have to eat too. The world tried to make them cheap, but cheap labour is not the same as cheap life. The factory owners understood clothing as business. The workers understood it as survival. Reformers understood it as a social problem. Buyers understood it as fashion. The city understood it, when it thought about it at all, as part of the noise and speed of progress. Everyone saw a different thing when they looked at the same blouse. That is why the Triangle story is not only about a single fire, it is about what America was willing not to see in order to enjoy what industrial labour made possible. The early 20th century loved efficiency. It loved growth. It loved new buildings, new products, new markets, new fortunes. It loved the idea that the country was becoming modern. But modernity had a back room. It had stairways and locked doors. It had girls with bent backs and tired hands. It had lungs breathing lint all day. It had families depending on wages that barely held. The more you look at these workers before the fire, the more the disaster stops feeling like an accident in the simple sense. A match may be accidental, a spark may be accidental, but a world that crowds workers into dangerous rooms and treats exits as matters of discipline has already prepared the ground. That does not mean anyone intended the deaths. Intention is not the only measure of responsibility. Much of history's harm comes from people accepting arrangements that are useful to them and dangerous to others. No owner had to wake up wishing harm on workers for harm to become likely. He only had to prefer control over trust, production over caution, savings over safeguards, and silence over complaint. There is a particular kind of sadness in knowing that some of the workers had already fought for better conditions and then returned to work in the same dangerous industry. That is not hypocrisy. That is poverty. People often ask why workers stayed in bad jobs, as if leaving were a door always open. But leaving requires somewhere else to go. It requires savings, connections, time, luck, language, strength, and often a family that can survive without your wage during the search. For many garment workers, the choice was not between danger and safety. It was between this dangerous job and another dangerous job, between this low wage and no wage, between this foreman and one who might be worse. The fact that a person returns to a harmful system does not mean she consents to the harm. It means the system has narrowed her choices. And still, inside those narrowed choices, they organised. That may be the most important thing to carry forward. They were not rescued into history only after they died. They had already entered history with their own voices. The shirtwaist strike showed that the girls who sewed America's clothes could also challenge America's conscience. They could stand in crowded halls and vote to continue. They could march through streets where people mock them. They could endure courtrooms where magistrates treated them as nuisances. They could insist that the hands making the modern wardrobe belonged to human beings, not extensions of machines. The tragedy of 1911 would make the country remember them as victims, but before that they were workers in motion. As we move closer to the day of the fire, keep these lives in the room. Do not let the smoke erase them. Think of the girl who woke before dawn and buttoned her own blouse before spending the day sewing blouses for strangers. Think of the mother counting on the envelope she would bring home. Think of the sister who borrowed a comb. Think of the worker who had once walked a picket line and then had to return to the machine because the rent did not care who was right. Think of the laughter that rose between tables when the foreman looked away. Think of languages crossing in the air. Yiddish, Italian, English, the mixed speech of a city that never waited for anyone to fully arrive before demanding labour from them. Think of the hands, because the hands are everywhere in this story. Hands guiding fabric, hands lifting bundles, hands reaching for wages, hands signing petitions, hands pushing through crowds, hands later searching for doors. The girls who sewed America's clothes lived in the space between visibility and disappearance. Their work was everywhere, but they were nearly nowhere in the public imagination until the fire forced their names into newspapers and onto death lists. That is one reason it matters to slow down here. Before the 8th floor burned, before the 9th floor became a trap, before the 10th floor scrambled toward the roof, there was a whole working world already burning in a slower way. Not with flame, but with exhaustion, pressure, disrespect, and risk made ordinary. The machines were already running, the scraps were already piling, the stairways were already there, the doors already had their habits. The girls already knew the rhythm of the place, the fastest route to the elevator, the mood of the foreman, the feel of the machine under their fingers, the relief that came when Saturday's closing time approached. And on the Saturday that would change American work forever, they entered the factory as they had entered it many times before, carrying lunch, worries, jokes, sleepiness, and the private hope that the day would pass without trouble. To understand what happened next, we have to step into that ordinary workday itself, into the rows of machines and the final hours before the room changed from a workplace into a place people could not escape. To understand the Triangle Factory, you have to forget the image of a factory as a single machine with walls around it. That is not quite what this place was. It was a business stacked high above the street, a set of rooms arranged for speed, order, supervision, and output. It was a place where hundreds of people entered every week and became part of a system that had been built to turn cloth into money as quickly as possible. The Triangle Waist Company occupied the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of the Ash Building, near Washington Square, and it employed roughly 500 workers, most of them young immigrant women and girls sewing women's blouses called shirtwaists. The building itself looked respectable. It was modern for its time. It was tall, busy, and solid, the kind of structure that told New York it was becoming a city of height and industry. If you had walked past it before the fire, you might not have stopped. You might have heard noise from above, seen workers entering or leaving, and gone on with your day. That is how danger often survives in public. It hides inside the familiar. Step inside on an ordinary work day before smoke changed the meaning of every door. The morning begins with bodies moving upward. Workers come through the entrance from the street, some still tired from the crowded rooms where they slept, some carrying lunch wrapped in paper or cloth, some speaking in quick bursts of Yiddish, Italian, or English. Some quiet because morning does not always give people conversation. They ride the elevator if they can, or take the stairs if they must, rising floor by floor into the workrooms. The higher they go, the farther they are from the sidewalk, from the open street, from any easy exit. But no one thinks of it that way most mornings. You do not walk into work every day measuring the distance between your chair and death. You think about wages. You think about whether the foreman is in a good mood. You think about whether your machine will run properly. You think about finishing enough pieces to make the day worth the time you're giving it. The workrooms themselves were crowded. That is the first thing the body would notice. Not simply busy, not merely full, but crowded in the specific way a profit-making room becomes crowded when every square foot is expected to earn. Long tables stretched across the floor, sewing machines sat close together. Workers were placed in rows, because rows are efficient, rows are visible, rows make it easier to supervise. Period accounts described machines placed so closely that there was barely aisle room for the girls between them, with shirtwaists hanging above and cuttings littering the upper floors. That detail matters. A room can have exits and still be difficult to leave if the path to those exits is narrow, blocked, confused, or crowded with bodies trying to move at once. During ordinary hours, a tight aisle is an inconvenience. In a panic, it becomes a trap. Picture one worker at her station. She sits at a machine with cloth in front of her, maybe a stack of sleeves, bodices, cuffs, collars, or pieces that will become part of a blouse someone else will wear. She does not make the whole garment from start to finish in the old household way, where one person might cut and sew and finish a thing slowly. Industrial work divides the garment into operations. One worker may sew one kind of seam again and again, another may attach a sleeve, another may finish a cuff, another may trim loose threads, another may press. This division makes the process faster, but it also changes how the worker experiences time. Instead of making an object, she repeats an action. The blouse passes through her hands only briefly, and then it moves on. Her body becomes trained around that one motion, that one job, that one section of the day. There is a particular fatigue that comes from repetition. It is not the same as carrying a heavy load across a field or chopping wood until the arms tremble. It is smaller and more constant. The shoulders tighten, the back curves, the eyes narrow. The fingers learn to move quickly and accurately while the mind drifts only so far because the needle is still there. If attention slips, the machine does not forgive you. Needles puncture fingers, cloth jams, thread breaks. A mistake can slow the line of work and draw the attention of a supervisor. And because wages often depended on speed and output, slowness was not just a personal frustration. It was money lost. A worker did not need someone shouting every second to feel pressure. The pile itself shouted, the clock shouted, the pay system shouted. The presence of other workers moving faster than you shouted without making a sound. The sound of the room would have been difficult to escape even in memory. Rows of machines running at once make a hard, constant noise. Not the soft domestic sound of one sewing machine in a home, but the layered clatter of industrial sewing, belts moving, metal parts striking, chairs shifting, feet working, voices trying to pass through the noise. A foreman's instruction has to cut across it. A joke has to be leaned into. A warning might be missed if it comes from the wrong direction. Noise is not only unpleasant, it changes what people can know. In a quiet room, a small sound can matter. In a factory room, small sounds vanish. The first cough of trouble may not travel far. The first shout may be mistaken for ordinary confusion. This matters because industrial danger often grows in the gap between what is happening and what workers are able to understand in time. The air had its own burden. Fabric work creates lint. Cutting creates scraps and dust. Shirtwaists were made from light cottons and other fabrics that gave off threads and clippings. Waste accumulated because production creates waste, and fast production creates it quickly. The US Department of Labor's historical account describes the fire as beginning in a crowded and littered workroom, fed by waste containers that were full after the day's work. Before the fire, that litter was part of the ordinary housekeeping problem of a busy factory. It was something to be swept, gathered, emptied, managed. But the word ordinary is doing dangerous work again. Cotton scraps do not become flammable only when the flame appears. They are flammable all day. Paper patterns are flammable all day. Hanging garments are flammable all day. A scrap bin under a cutting table is not waiting to become dangerous. It already is dangerous. It is only waiting to be found by a spark. And yet, if you had asked someone in the middle of the workday whether the room felt like a place of death, many might have said no. That is one of the most important things about ordinary danger. People adjust to it. Workers get used to narrow aisles. They get used to crowded exits. They get used to smells, heat, dust, and blocked spaces. They get used to doors being watched, bags being checked, supervisors controlling movement. A person can become accustomed to almost anything if the alternative is hunger. This does not mean she thinks it is good. It means she learns how to move inside it. She learns which aisle is easiest when people are standing. She learns when the elevator is crowded. She learns where to put her coat. She learns which foreman notices lateness and which one notices talking. She learns the geography of control. Now think about the doors. In a workplace, doors seem simple. They let people in and out. But inside Triangle, doors were tied to suspicion. Owners and managers feared theft, feared workers leaving early, feared loss of material, feared disorder. Cornell's account notes that owners had frequently locked exit doors in the past, claiming workers stole materials, and survivors later described attempts to open ninth-floor doors to the Washington Place stairs. During a normal day, this practice might look like business discipline. Workers enter. Workers leave by the approved route. Bags are inspected. Time is controlled. It is unpleasant, but it has become part of the system. The problem is that fire does not respect the difference between normal control and emergency escape. A locked door does not know why it was locked. It simply refuses. I want you to imagine noticing that door on an ordinary day, not during the fire, not with smoke at your back, just noticing it as you pass it, maybe irritated, maybe resigned. You may know it is locked, or often locked. You may know who has the key. You may know the rule. You may also know that complaining could cost you your job. That door teaches a lesson before it kills anyone. It teaches you that the employer's fear of losing cloth matters more than your freedom to move. It teaches you that you are being watched not only as a worker, but as a possible thief. It teaches you that your time in the building belongs to someone else until the working day officially releases you. When people later asked how such a thing could happen, part of the answer is that the door had already been accepted as normal by the people with power to change it. The factory had more than one way out in theory. There were stairways, there were elevators, there was a fire escape, there was access upward toward the roof from some floors. But escape in theory is not the same as escape in practice. OSHA's historical account notes that the building had only one fire escape, that long tables and bulky machines trapped many victims, that workers struggled with locked doors or doors opening the wrong way, and that only a few buckets of water were available to fight the flames. That sentence, when you slow it down, is not one failure. It is a chain. One fire escape. Long tables, bulky machines, locked doors, wrong-way doors, few buckets. Each item alone might be explained away by someone determined to explain it away. Together they describe a building where survival depended on too many things going perfectly at the same time. During the workday, the elevators would have seemed like ordinary convenience. Workers used them. Owners used them. Goods moved in and out. But an elevator in an emergency is a fragile hope, especially when hundreds of people are above the street and only minutes matter. It can carry only so many at once. It can be blocked. It can stop. The operator can be overwhelmed by people desperate to enter. In ordinary life, waiting for an elevator is annoying. In a fire, waiting becomes a calculation the body makes before the mind can speak. Can I fit? Will it come back? Is the stair better? Where is the smoke? Is the door open? Those are not questions anyone should have to answer while the room behind them burns. The fire escape is another detail that looked like safety without being safety. From the street, a fire escape can give comfort because it makes danger seem accounted for. There it is, attached to the wall, proof that someone thought about escape. But the Triangle fire escape was not the kind of secure, sufficient route that could carry a factory full of workers down from the upper floors. Cornell's account says that for all practical purposes, the 9th floor fire escape led nowhere safe and bent under the weight of workers trying to escape. Before the fire, it was part of the building's safety story. During the fire, it became part of the disaster. This is one of the bitterest kinds of failure, when the thing meant to reassure people only postpones the truth until the exact moment when truth costs lives. Inside the workroom, supervision shaped the day. The owners were not standing beside every worker all the time, but authority was present in foremen, rules, pay systems, and the layout itself. Factories are designed to make workers visible. Rows of machines are not only efficient for production, they are efficient for watching. The worker knows when she is seen. She knows when she can whisper and when she cannot. She knows whether going to the washroom will be noticed. She knows whether looking away from the machine for too long is risky. This creates a kind of mental posture. Even when no one speaks, the worker carries the supervisor inside her own movements. Hurry. Keep your head down. Do not lose your place. Do not give them a reason. Lunch, if taken in the factory, would not have transformed the day into rest. It might be brief, practical, eaten near the work area or in whatever space was permitted. A piece of bread, something wrapped from home, maybe fruit, maybe cheese, maybe a small food bought on the way. Some workers would talk, some would sit quietly. Some would compare wages or complain about the room. Some would mention family. Some would repeat news from the union world. The break would end before the body felt ready. Then back to the machine, back to the pile, back to the motion, to the... This is how a long workday passes. Not as one giant block of suffering, but as many small returns to the same demand. There were men in the factory too. Cutters, pressers, supervisors, shipping workers, and others. The popular memory focuses on the young women, and rightly so, because they made up so much of the workforce and so many of the dead. But the factory was also divided by gender in ways that shaped pay and power. Men were more likely to hold certain skilled or supervisory positions. Women made up much of the sewing labour and were often paid less. This mattered in daily life. A young woman could be fast, skilled, and essential to production, while still being treated as replaceable. Her work could support a family while the workplace treated her like a girl who should be grateful for the job. That contradiction ran through the garment industry. The economy needed women's labour, but society did not fully honour women's labour. The factory used their speed while underestimating their voice, and their voices were there. That is worth remembering inside the noise. The Triangle workers were not silent figures bent over cloth all day without thought. They had opinions. They knew which rules were unfair. They knew which shops were worse. They knew about the strike of 1909. Some had taken part in labour actions, and many would have known the cost of organising. There may have been workers in that room who still carried anger from the failed demands for better conditions. There may have been others who wanted no trouble, who needed the wage and feared politics. A factory floor is not a single mind. It contains arguments, loyalties, fears, friendships, resentments, and private calculations. One girl may admire a union organiser. Another may think strikes bring too much risk. Another may agree with the union, but stay quiet because her mother needs the money now. These differences do not make the workers weak. They make them real. By afternoon, the room changes. Anyone who has worked a long shift knows this. Morning has a certain discipline. Midday has endurance. Late afternoon has waiting inside it. The body begins measuring the remaining time. The machine noise feels sharper because you're tired of hearing it. The chair feels harder. The light through the window shifts. The pile in front of you becomes a negotiation. Can I finish this before closing? Will this last piece matter? Is there enough time to do one more? On Saturdays, that feeling must have been stronger because Sunday waited on the other side. Not leisure in the modern sense for everyone, not a full day of rest free from chores, but a break from the factory for many. A chance to sleep a little more, attend religious services, see relatives, walk outside, wash clothes, mend clothes, help at home, breathe different air. The Triangle work week was long by modern standards, and Saturday still belonged to the employer for part of the day. The common rhythm of the industry placed workers at machines for many hours across 6 days, and the end of Saturday carried the emotional weight of release. A worker watching the clock near closing time is not thinking historically. She's thinking about getting out. She's thinking about stairs, wages, home, maybe a friend waiting below. She may be thinking about a dance that evening or a family obligation she cannot avoid. She may be annoyed that the last minutes always seem slower than the first. The ordinary life of the factory presses right up against the disaster, and that closeness is what makes the story so difficult. There was no great warning dividing the safe part of the day from the fatal part. There was only the day, continuing as usual until it did not. Think of the objects in the room during those final ordinary hours. A chair pushed close to a machine. A spool of thread. A bent pin. A pair of scissors. A sleeve half attached. A scrap bin beneath a cutting table. A coat hanging somewhere nearby. A lunch wrapper left behind. A pay envelope expected soon. A clock. A door. A key. These objects are plain, almost boring. History often turns on plain objects. The door does not look dramatic. The key does not look dramatic. The scrap bin does not look dramatic. The aisle between tables does not look dramatic. But when the room changes, every ordinary object takes sides. The scissors are useless. The machine becomes an obstacle. The table blocks movement. The scrap bin feeds flame. The door decides who can pass. The key is somewhere else. This is why workplace safety is not only about heroic rescue. It is about the arrangement of ordinary things before anything goes wrong. Are exits clear? Do doors open outward? Can workers leave without permission in an emergency? Are scraps removed? Are alarms audible? Are drills practiced? Are stairs wide enough? Are fire escapes strong enough? Are people treated as lives before they are treated as labour? Triangle sits in American memory because so many of those questions were answered badly before anyone needed the answers. Once the fire began, courage mattered, quick thinking mattered, luck mattered, but the most important choices had already been made by people who were not yet afraid. There is something else to notice about the ash building. It was called fireproof by the standards of its time, and in a narrow sense that was partly true. The structure itself did not collapse in the way an older wooden building might have, but the people inside were not fireproof. The contents were not fireproof. The cloth was not fireproof. The waste was not fireproof. The assumption that a modern building meant a safe workplace was one of the illusions the fire destroyed. A building can survive while its workers die. That is not safety. That is only architecture protecting itself. As the workday moved toward its end on March 25, 1911, the factory was still itself. Machines still ran. Workers still sat in rows. The street below still moved with Saturday life. On the 8th floor, near the cutting tables, the materials of disaster sat in place. On the 9th floor, workers continued their tasks with no real warning of how little time remained. On the 10th floor, the owners and office staff were present above the main production floors, close enough to danger to flee upward when the alarm reached them. The building contained different chances for survival depending on where a person happened to be standing or sitting when the first flames spread. That randomness is another cruelty. In disasters, location can become fate. A few feet nearer a stair, a few seconds earlier to the elevator, a place on the 8th floor instead of the 9th, a door open instead of locked, a body near a window, a body far from one. History later gives us totals, but the people inside lived it as position, timing, smoke, and breath. I want to stay for one more moment in the ordinary room before the fire, because once it burns, we will never be able to see it innocently again. The workers do not yet know their names will be read by strangers more than a century later. They do not know that reformers will argue over their deaths, that laws will be passed in their wake, that memorials will be built, that school children will learn their story as a lesson in workplace safety. They know the weight of the day. They know the feel of cloth. They know whether their feet hurt. They know who sat beside them. They know the nearest path they usually take when the day ends. They know which exits they are expected to use. They know the rules of the room because the room has trained them. And then, near closing time, the ordinary rules begin to fail. A small flame appears where flame has no business being. At first it is still a factory problem, something to be noticed, shouted about, maybe fought with a bucket. Then it grows into something larger than the room's arrangements can handle. The scraps catch. The hanging garments and cuttings give the fire more to consume. Workers look up from machines. Chairs move. Voices rise. Someone runs. Someone turns toward a stairway. Someone thinks of the elevator. Someone thinks of a friend on another floor. Someone believes there is still time because the mind often grants a few extra seconds of hope before it accepts the size of danger. The factory that had spent years teaching people to stay in place is suddenly demanding that they flee, and everything about how the room was built, crowded, locked and supervised is about to matter at once. Saturday afternoon has a particular feeling in a workplace. Even now, more than a century later, most of us recognise it. The week has not quite released you, but you can feel its grip weakening. The body begins to lean toward the door before the clock allows it. People start thinking about the street, the evening, the meal waiting at home, the small freedom of not having to return until Monday. On March 25th, 1911, that feeling was moving through the Triangle Waste Company as the workday neared its end. The machines were still running. The workers were still at their tables. The piles of cloth had not vanished just because the hour was late. But the day was close enough to finishing that the room had begun, in small ways, to loosen. Some workers would have been thinking about wages, some about supper, some about friends, some about the Sabbath already underway for Jewish families or Sunday coming for others. Some may have been too tired to think about anything clearly at all. And then, at about 4:40 in the afternoon, on the 8th floor of the Ash building, a small fire flared up in a scrap bin beneath a cutter's table near the northeast corner of the room. Investigators later believed the likely cause was an unextinguished match or cigarette thrown into a bin packed with fabric cuttings, paper, and other waste left from weeks of production. That is how it began, not with an explosion, not with a dramatic warning, not with the building groaning or the sky darkening or any of the signals that stories sometimes give before disaster. It began in a bin of scraps, the kind of thing that belonged so completely to the ordinary life of the factory that it could almost disappear from attention. Scraps were everywhere in a garment shop. Every shirtwaist cut from cloth left behind small pieces that had no use in the finished garment. The cutters worked through layers of fabric, shaping sleeves, collars, cuffs, fronts, backs, the soft pieces of women's clothing that would be sewn into something neat and saleable. What was not needed fell away. It collected in bins, it gathered beneath tables, it mixed with tissue patterns and dust and lint. During a normal day, it was waste. At 4:40, it became fuel. There is something almost unbearable about the smallness of that beginning. A match, a cigarette, a glow in the wrong place. A bit of carelessness maybe, though even that word can become too easy if we let it carry the whole burden. Because the fire did not become deadly simply because something hot touched something dry. It became deadly because the room was ready for it. The factory had prepared itself all week, all month, perhaps longer, in the way it handled waste, crowded workers, hung garments, arranged tables, controlled exits, and treated safety as a secondary concern. Fire is often described as sudden, and in one sense it is. Flame can leap into life in a second, but the conditions that allow it to become catastrophe are usually older. They are built gradually by habit, by neglect, by money saved, by rules that seem practical until the room fills with smoke. At first, someone saw it as a problem to be solved. That is important. The first instinct was not to understand it as history. The first instinct was to put it out. A worker noticed flame near the cutting table. There may have been a shout. Someone may have turned from a machine, irritated at first by the interruption before realizing what it was. In the early seconds of any fire, the mind tries to keep the world ordinary. It says this can be handled. It says someone has a bucket. It says the room is full of people, and surely people will know what to do. That little gap between danger and full belief can be fatal, but it is also deeply human. Most people do not accept disaster immediately. They negotiate with it. They try to fit it into the day they were already having. Men on the 8th floor did try to fight the flames. Workers reached for the available fire pails. They tried water. They tried to smother the growing fire. But there were only a few buckets on hand, and the fire had the advantage from the first moment, because it was feeding on exactly the kind of material that burns quickly. Dry cotton scraps, paper patterns, wooden tables, hanging garments, and the loose waste of a fast-moving garment shop. Osher's historical account notes that only a few buckets of water were available, while the building had crowded rooms, long tables, bulky machines, locked or badly arranged doors, and only one fire escape, which later collapsed under the weight of desperate workers. The attempt to fight the fire was not foolish. It was simply overwhelmed. A bucket of water is an act of hope. Against a room already full of fuel, hope is not always enough. The emergency hose was supposed to be part of that hope. A hose inside a factory means someone, at some point, had imagined fire. It means safety had been given a visible form. But safety equipment that does not work is worse than nothing in one particular way. It steals time while people believe it may save them. Accounts of the Triangle fire describe workers trying to use the hose and finding it useless, with no water coming through when it was needed. The National Park Service summarizes the failure plainly. The emergency fire hose would not turn on. Think about the seconds inside that failure. Someone pulls at the hose, someone expects resistance, then water, then a chance. Instead, there is nothing useful. No strong stream cutting into the flame, no sudden reversal, no proof that the building's safety measures had substance behind them. Just smoke, heat, confusion, and the terrible realization that the thing meant for this exact moment cannot answer. The fire moved fast. That is the fact that has to be repeated because narration is slower than flame. Words walk, fire runs. Within minutes, the 8th floor was being consumed, and workers who had been finishing a Saturday shift were forced into a race against a force that had no interest in panic, pleading, youth, poverty, or plans for the evening. The blaze rose through the waste and jumped into cloth. It found the hanging shirtwaists. It ran along paper. It climbed where air fed it. It turned the room's production into its own engine. All week, the factory had been making clothing. In those minutes, the factory fed itself to the fire through the very materials that made its profits possible. Imagine the 8th floor now, not as a historical diagram, but as a room full of bodies trying to understand motion. Chairs scraping backward, machines abandoned, cloth falling, people shouting names, someone coughing, someone pushing toward a stairway, someone trying to warn others. The sound of sewing machines would have broken apart, first unevenly, then completely, as workers stopped and rose. A factory floor that had been arranged around labour suddenly had to become an escape route, but it had not been designed with that urgency in mind. Long tables, machines, piles, chairs, and narrow aisles shaped the way people could move. In ordinary time, everyone had learned how to navigate those aisles. In panic, the familiar room became strange. A path that one person could walk easily became blocked when dozens moved together. The 8th floor had one advantage that the 9th floor did not have. It saw the fire first. That may sound obvious, but it made all the difference. The people on the 8th floor were closest to the beginning, which meant they had the first warning. Many were able to run before the full force of the flames blocked the routes. They escaped by stairways, elevators, and whatever exits they could reach. Later testimony and reports would show that the greatest loss of life was not on the 8th floor, but above it, especially on the 9th. One fireman later testified that no bodies were found on the 8th floor, while the 9th held many of the dead. That fact can sound like a mercy for the 8th floor, and in a narrow sense it was, but it also tells us something devastating. A few seconds of warning, a slightly better route, a door that could be used, a position nearer escape. These were the differences between survival and death. Not virtue, not strength, not deserving, position and time. One of the people on the 8th floor managed to telephone the 10th floor. That call mattered. It carried warning upward to the owners, office staff and workers above the main blaze. A bookkeeper on the 8th floor warned the 10th floor by telephone, but there was no audible alarm system and no way to telephone or directly warn the 9th floor in time. This is one of the cruelest arrangements in the entire story. The warning travelled past the floor that would suffer most. It jumped, by telephone wire, from the 8th to the 10th, while the 9th floor remained in the path of fire without the same chance to prepare. Modern people are used to alarms as a public voice inside a building. A bell rings and everyone knows. A strobe flashes. A voice comes over a speaker. The building itself tells you to leave. At Triangle, there was no such universal warning. Information moved unevenly, privately, imperfectly. It reached some and missed others. Think about the 9th floor for a moment, even though we are still standing with the 8th. Above the fire, workers were continuing in ordinary time for a little longer. They may have heard noise below, maybe not. They may have smelled smoke, perhaps only when it was already too late. One survivor later said the first warning on the 9th floor came at the same time as the fire itself. That sentence is hard to absorb because warning is supposed to come before danger. That is what warning means. But for many on the 9th floor there was no separate warning. The fire was the message. Smoke came through. Heat followed. People turned and understood all at once that the workday had ended without releasing them. On the 10th floor, the warning did arrive. That floor had its own panic, but also a route that would save many. People moved toward the roof, and neighbouring buildings and people nearby helped some escape across the rooftops. The owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, were there that afternoon and survived. Their survival would later become one of the bitter facts people could not stop talking about, not because survival itself is a crime, but because of the contrast. The men who owned the factory found a way out. So many of the girls who made the factory profitable did not. That contrast lodged in public memory because it seemed to say something about the structure of the whole world. Those above, with warning and access, escaped upward. Those below them, trapped by smoke, locked doors, failed equipment and bad design, were left to find whatever chance remained. But let us not rush too far ahead. Stay with the 8th floor in the first minutes. The fire is spreading. People are running. Someone at a machine may still be trying to gather belongings before realizing there is no time. This is another human detail worth holding. In emergencies, people sometimes reach for coats, bags, pay envelopes, hats, not because they misunderstand danger entirely, but because ordinary life clings to the body for a few seconds too long. A coat means the street. A bag means wages or papers or lunch things or a small personal possession. We like to imagine that in disaster we would instantly become pure survival, but people do not shed their lives so cleanly. They hesitate. They grab what they have always needed. Then the smoke teaches them what can be left behind. Smoke changes a room faster than flame in some ways. Flame is visible. Smoke steals visibility. It confuses direction. It turns the known room into a darkened maze. It enters the throat and makes every breath a decision. It lowers people's bodies toward the floor. It makes voices rough and then useless. In a factory full of cloth, paper, wood, oil, and human fear, smoke would have thickened quickly. The windows might have seemed like relief because they held light. A person turns toward light instinctively. But on the 8th floor, unlike on the floors above where escape became more desperate, many still had routes. This is the strange, uneven map of disaster again. The same building contained multiple fates. On one floor, people fled through stairs. On another, people would later gather at windows. On the top floor, people reached the roof. The fire did not distribute danger equally. Architecture never does. The first alarm from outside was reportedly sent at 4:45 p.m. by a passerby who saw smoke coming from the 8th floor windows. Picture that person on the street. Perhaps at first it is only smoke where smoke should not be. A darkening window, a strange movement above. New York streets were noisy, distracted places, full of vendors, students, workers, carts, conversations, and the usual restlessness of Saturday afternoon. For a few seconds, the disaster was visible only as something wrong high above the sidewalk. Then the alarm went out. The city's fire response began to move. Horses, engines, men, ladders, hoses, all of it starting toward Washington Place. Help was coming. That is true. But help coming is not the same as help arriving in time, and arriving in time is not the same as being able to reach. Inside, those 5 minutes mattered more than almost anything. 5 minutes can be nothing in a normal day. It is the amount of time you lose looking for keys, the time between one streetcar and the next, the time a worker might spend stretching a sore hand or swallowing food too quickly. But in the Triangle Factory, 5 minutes was enough for the 8th floor to become an inferno, and for danger to rise toward workers who had not been warned properly. The National Park Service notes that within 5 minutes, the 8th floor was consumed. When people say a fire spread quickly, the phrase can become dull from repetition. Within 5 minutes is not dull. It is terrifying. It means that while one person was deciding which way to run, the room was already changing behind her. It means that by the time someone understood the scale had grown again. Fire also creates a hierarchy of knowledge. The person nearest the flame knows first. The person near the door knows whether the door opens. The person by the telephone knows whether someone above can be reached. The person in the stairwell knows whether smoke has already claimed it. The person on another floor knows almost nothing until sound, smell, or heat arrives. In the Triangle Factory, knowledge moved through shouting, running, telephone calls, and instinct. It did not move through a planned system designed to save everyone. That absence is not a small detail. A workplace without a reliable alarm is a workplace where survival depends on rumour, and rumour is slow compared with flame. Someone shouts fire, someone else hears only noise, someone thinks it is on another part of the floor, someone thinks it has been put out, someone runs, and the running itself becomes information. People often understand danger by watching others move. A crowd rising at once tells the body what the ears have missed. On the 8th floor, the movement would have become contagious. One table rises, another follows. A worker sees faces change. The room's mood breaks. The old discipline collapses because the machine no longer has the authority. The foreman no longer has the authority. The pile of unfinished shirtwaists no longer has authority. Only the path out matters now. There is a grim irony here. For years, the factory had trained workers to be efficient, fast, obedient, and focused. In the fire, they needed space, information, freedom of movement, and exits that trusted them. The ordinary logic of the workplace became useless, worse than useless in some cases. Aisles arranged for production slowed escape. Doors managed for discipline became hazards. Lack of drills left people to improvise. The same system that had extracted speed from workers had not prepared to protect them when speed became a matter of life. This is one of the reasons Triangle became such a powerful symbol. It showed that efficiency without safety is not true efficiency at all. It is only danger postponed. The owners had worried about theft. That concern was common in the industry. Cloth could be stolen. Finished pieces could disappear. Time could be cheated. Employers often saw workers through suspicion. But on March 25th, the cost of suspicion became visible. A policy that may have saved some fabric or a few minutes of labour could not be morally defended when weighed against bodies at locked exits. Not every detail of every door would be settled easily in court, and the legal aftermath would become its own painful story. But the public understood the broader truth quickly. Workers had been treated as people to control, not people to protect. That understanding became harder to bury than the official arguments. As the 8th floor emptied, some workers would have made it down the stairs into the street. Imagine that transition. One moment, heat at your back. The next, air. The sidewalk. The city. Noise. The shock of being alive while others are still inside. Survivors often carry that first breath with them. It is not simple relief. It is relief mixed with confusion, guilt, fear for friends, and the awful need to look back. A worker who escaped from the 8th floor might have turned toward the building and seen smoke above, knowing people remained there. She might have thought of a sister on another floor, a friend from the machines, a cousin, a girl she sat beside every day. Escape does not end fear when the people you know have not escaped with you. Meanwhile, the fire moved upward. Heat and smoke do not respect floor numbers. They climb through openings, stairwells, shafts, cracks, and any path the building gives them. The 8th floor was not an isolated room burning in private. It was part of a vertical workplace. The floors above were connected not only by business, ownership, and labour, but by air. Once the fire had taken hold, the building itself became the route by which danger travelled. This is why the telephone warning to the 10th floor and the lack of warning to the 9th matter so deeply. The fire was already moving through the building faster than the workers' information network could match. There are disasters where nature overwhelms human planning. Earthquakes, storms, floods, events so large that people argue afterward about what could really have been done. Triangle was different. It was not a hurricane. It was not lightning striking an open field. It was a workplace fire in a building full of known risks. That does not mean every death could have been prevented by one simple action, but it does mean the disaster belonged to human choices. Scraps could be cleared, doors could be unlocked, drills could be practiced, alarms could be installed, hoses could be tested, fire escapes could be built to hold people, exits could be arranged for escape rather than control. The tragedy was not that no one had ever imagined fire. The tragedy was that fire had been imagined just enough to create the appearance of preparation, but not enough to save the people most at risk. I keep thinking about the workers who had already survived the first minutes on the 8th floor. Some may have stumbled outside coughing, their clothes smelling of smoke. Some may have looked upward and seen faces at windows. Some may have heard the crowd changing from curiosity to horror. The fire engines would be arriving or approaching. People would be pointing. The street would be filling. And in that moment, the factory ceased to be a private workplace. It became a public event. The conditions that had belonged to owners, managers, inspectors, and workers were suddenly exposed to everyone standing below. A locked door is hidden until people die behind it. A failed hose is hidden until smoke pours from the windows. A weak fire escape is hidden until bodies trust it and it bends. The fire opened the building in the most terrible way possible, but inside there was not yet public meaning. Inside there was breath and movement and decisions made too quickly to remember clearly later. On the 8th floor, those who could flee fled. Those who tried to help warned who they could. The telephone call went upward. No call reached the 9th. The flames continued. The smoke thickened. The room that had been filled with the repeated sound of machines was now filled with a different noise entirely. Running feet, breaking glass, shouting, coughing, the roar of cloth and paper burning faster than anyone's mind could accept. The workday had not ended. It had been torn open. And just above, on the 9th floor, the workers who had not received the warning were still in the path of what was coming. They had the same machines, the same crowded arrangements, the same high windows, the same distance from the street, but less time. Some would run toward the Green Street stair, some toward the Washington Place stair, some toward the elevators, some toward the fire escape. Some toward the windows, because a window, when the room behind you is burning, stops being scenery and becomes a question. The 8th floor was where the fire began, but the 9th floor was where the factory's failures would become impossible for the city to deny. And as the flames climbed and the smoke entered that room, the people inside began looking for exits that should have been ready for them long before Saturday afternoon. The 9th floor is where the story becomes hardest to hold, because it was close enough to safety for safety to seem possible, and far enough from it for almost every possible route to fail. The fire had begun below on the 8th floor near the cutting tables, and the workers there had the terrible advantage of seeing danger early. Many on the 8th floor escaped because the warning began where they were standing. The 10th floor received a telephone call, and many people there were able to move toward the roof. But the 9th floor, crowded with workers at machines and tables, did not receive the same warning. There was no automatic fire alarm system carrying one clear message through the building. There was no loud bell ordering everyone out. There was no practiced drill that turned panic into habit. According to the National Park Service, workers managed to warn the 10th floor, but they had no way to reach the 9th floor, and there was no fire alarm system they could trigger. Think about what that means in human time. One floor below, people are already running. One floor above, people have been told. Between them, the floor that will lose the most people is still inside ordinary seconds. A worker may be finishing a seam. Another may be standing to stretch. Another may be thinking about closing time. Another may be annoyed by smoke before understanding what smoke means. Then the warning arrives not as a warning, but as the emergency itself. The fire comes up through the building and into their lives with no polite separation between first notice and real danger. People look up, they smell it, they hear shouting, they see movement. Then the room changes from a workplace into a problem the body has to solve immediately. The exits should have been the answer. That is what exits are for. In a building full of workers, high above the street, exits are not decorations or conveniences. They are promises made in architecture. A stairway says there is a way down. A door says it will open. A fire escape says, if the normal path fails, this one will hold you. An elevator says it can carry you between floors. A window says there is air and light, but it is not supposed to become a route. On the 9th floor of the Triangle Factory, those promises broke apart one by one. Workers ran toward the stairways. The Green Street stairway became blocked by flame and smoke. The Washington Place stairway door was locked or would not open for the workers trying to use it. Later accounts and investigations would return again and again to the locked doors, the doors that opened the wrong way, the inadequate fire escape, and the crowded arrangement of tables and machines that slowed escape. OSHA's historical account lists those failures plainly. Long tables and bulky machines trapped many victims. Some doors were locked or opened the wrong way, and the building had only one fire escape, which collapsed during the disaster. A locked door in a fire is different from almost every other object in the room. A table can be climbed over, a chair can be shoved aside, cloth can be dropped, a machine can be abandoned. But a locked door turns effort into uselessness. It makes the body spend its last strength on an object that does not respond. Imagine reaching it with smoke behind you. Imagine people pressing in from behind because everyone understands that the stairway beyond it may be the way down. Someone pulls, someone pushes, someone shouts, someone thinks there must be a mistake, someone thinks the door is stuck, someone thinks someone else has the key. The people in front cannot open it, and the people behind may not know why the line is not moving. Panic does not move cleanly. It piles up. It crushes hope into the few square feet around the thing that will not open. Some workers turn toward the elevators. The elevators did save lives. That should be remembered because the story is not only a list of failures. Elevator operators made dangerous trips, carrying workers down while heat and smoke filled the building. They went back when going back was not safe. They loaded people in as quickly as they could, but elevators are small and fire is not. Only so many people can fit into a car at once. Only so many trips can be made before heat damages the mechanism, before smoke makes the shaft dangerous, before desperate bodies crowd the doors. Some workers, trapped above, forced elevator doors open and tried to jump into the shaft, hoping to land on the roof of the elevator car or slide down cables. Some died there. In that moment, even an empty shaft looked less impossible than the room behind them. That is what desperation does. It makes the mind compare terrible options and choose the one that still seems to contain motion. The fire escape was another hope, and it failed in a way that made people understand afterward how little the appearance of safety can mean. Fire escapes had become familiar on city buildings, those iron structures attached to walls like a second skeleton. From the street they suggested preparation. They suggested that a building had made room for emergency. But the Triangle fire escape was narrow, weak, and inadequate for the number of people who needed it. It was attached to a tall building full of workers, but it was not able to carry the weight of their need. As people crowded onto it, it twisted and collapsed, sending workers down to the pavement and cutting off that route for others. Reports and later summaries describe the fire escape as flimsy and insufficient, and some accounts note that it gave way under the weight of those trying to flee. The collapse of a fire escape carries a particular betrayal. A person stepping onto it is not making a reckless choice. She is doing what the building has told her to do. She is trusting the metal. She is trusting the law that allowed it to count as safety. She's trusting the idea that someone, somewhere, had considered her body in an emergency. When it gives way, it reveals that the trust was never fully earned. For those still inside, the collapse removes not only one route, but also a piece of belief. If the stair is blocked, the door locked, the elevator overwhelmed, and the fire escape broken, what remains? The windows remain. This is where the crowd below enters the story, because the windows turned a workplace disaster into a public trauma. The workers were high above the street, but not hidden. The Ash Building stood near Washington Square, in a neighbourhood where people were outside on a Saturday afternoon. Students, residents, passers-by, shopkeepers, delivery men, neighbours, and people drawn by smoke began to gather. At first, many may not have understood what they were seeing. Smoke from a high floor, fire engines arriving, faces at windows. Then the situation became clear with a speed that must have felt unreal. There were people up there who could not get out. There were people pressed to windows because the room behind them was burning. Firefighters arrived quickly. That is another fact that matters because it removes the easy comfort of imagining that help was simply late. Help was not enough. The fire department came with the tools it had, and those tools could not reach the upper floors where workers were trapped. Several historical summaries note that firefighters' ladders were too short to reach the top floors of the 10-story building. The ladders rose from the street toward the smoke, but stopped below the people who needed them. Imagine being at a window and seeing a ladder coming upward. Imagine the first surge of hope. Then imagine understanding that it will not reach. A few stories of distance in that moment becomes a wall as solid as brick. This is one of those details modern people have trouble feeling because we live in a world that assumes emergency technology has been matched to the buildings around us. We assume that if a building is 10 stories high, rescue equipment has been built with 10 stories in mind. But New York had grown upward faster than rescue had fully caught up. The city loved tall buildings, dense workrooms, and the money that could be made above expensive land. But when workers appeared at 9th floor windows, the fire department's ladders could not climb high enough to meet them. The city had built workplaces above the reach of its own rescue. The firefighters tried safety nets too. These were held below by men hoping to catch those who fell or jumped. It is hard to imagine a more desperate rescue attempt. A net gives the crowd something to do with its helplessness. It turns spectators into people holding on. It says, maybe this body can be caught. Maybe the fall can be interrupted. but the height was too great, the force too violent, and too many people were coming down. The nets tore or failed under the impact. Some workers jumped and missed them entirely. Others struck them with such force that no human hands could hold. A New York Times survivor account preserved in Cornell's archive described girls standing on windowsills and jumping, one after another, and said one girl jumped far over the net and was killed instantly. I want to be careful here because this part of the story is often repeated in ways that become almost unbearable, and it should not be turned into spectacle. The people at those windows were not images. They were not symbols yet. They were workers making the last decision left to them. The room behind them held fire, smoke, heat, and suffocation. The street below held height and stone. Neither was safety. When people jumped, it was not because they did not understand the danger of falling. They understood. The choice was not between life and death in any simple way. It was between one kind of death and another, between burning where they stood and taking the only movement still available. The crowd below saw this happen. That is why the disaster cut so deeply into the city's memory. People did not read about it days later as distant tragedy. They stood in the street and watched living people come to windows, hesitate, cling, pray, scream, hold hands, and fall. Some witnesses shouted for them not to jump, others could not speak, some fainted, some ran away and came back. Some stood frozen because the mind can refuse to process what the eyes are seeing. The first body striking the pavement must have changed the whole sound of the street. A reporter who witnessed the fire, William Gunn Shepherd, later wrote of learning a sound that day more horrible than description could picture, the sound of a living body striking stone. There are sounds that become part of history even when they cannot be reproduced. The clatter of the machines before the fire, the shout when the first flame was seen, the horses and engines arriving, the crack of glass, the crowd calling upward, the bodies hitting the sidewalk, the silence afterward in the spaces between screams. When we tell the story now, more than a century later, we tend to rely on numbers because numbers are stable. 146 dead, most of them women and girls, many Jewish and Italian immigrants. But the people below did not experience the disaster as numbers, they experienced it as sequence. One person at a window, then another, then two together, then the crowd realizing that this would not stop quickly. The windows themselves became terrible frames. Inside them, workers were visible at the very edge of the building, pressed by heat behind them and empty space before them. Some climbed onto sills, some held to the frames, some waited as long as they could. Clothing caught fire, hair burned, smoke pushed out around them. In accounts from the time, witnesses described workers tearing at their hair, clinging to casings, and then jumping when flame reached them. There is no way to make this gentle, and we should not pretend it was gentle, but we can keep it human. A person at a window in that moment is not only afraid, she may also be thinking of her mother. She may be thinking of a sister somewhere in the room. She may be thinking in Yiddish or Italian or English or no words at all. She may be aware of the crowd, or she may see only light and distance. She may jump alone. She may take someone's hand. Some people did hold hands. Witnesses spoke of pairs jumping together. That detail has stayed in the public memory because it is both horrifying and tender. When escape disappears, companionship can remain for a few seconds longer. A hand in another hand does not save the body, but it says the person is not entirely alone. It is difficult to know exactly what passed between workers in those moments. We should not invent speeches for them. But a held hand is a kind of speech. It says, "Stay with me." It says, "I am here." It says, if this is what is left, we will not meet it completely separately. Below, the firefighters were forced to work inside a scene no training could make ordinary. They were not cowards. They were not indifferent. They raised ladders, stretched hoses, held nets, tried to control the street, and entered the building where they could. But the tools available to them could not undo the building's failures quickly enough. This is another lesson Triangle forces on us. Rescue is not a substitute for prevention. By the time people are standing at ninth-floor windows choosing between smoke and pavement, the meaningful safety decisions have already been missed. A better fire code written before the fire matters more than a brave firefighter after it begins. An unlocked door matters more than a net held too far below. A strong fire escape matters more than a crowd praying that iron will hold after the fact. The crowd grew because disaster attracts witnesses, but also because people wanted to help and did not know how. Some ran to nearby buildings. Some called for doctors. Some tried to keep others back from falling bodies. Some carried the injured. Some looked for water. Some simply stood, ashamed of their own uselessness. A crowd at a disaster is never one thing. It contains horror, curiosity, compassion, panic, confusion, and the need to be near enough to understand what is happening. People later remembered the fire not only because of what they saw, but because seeing it made them part of it. They became witnesses, and witness carries responsibility. You cannot unknow a thing like that. Frances Perkins was among the people who saw the fire that day. She was nearby when the commotion began and reached the scene while the disaster was unfolding. She later connected what she saw at Triangle to the labour reform work that defined her life. Years afterward, she would become Secretary of Labour under Franklin D. Roosevelt, the first woman to hold a US cabinet position, and she described the Triangle fire as a turning point in her understanding of the need for stronger protections for workers. It is easy to say one person was changed by witnessing tragedy, but in Perkins' case the statement has real historical weight. She was not merely saddened. She carried the memory into policy, into commissions, into legislation, into the argument that government had a duty to protect workers from preventable harm. Still, on the street that afternoon, no one was yet thinking in terms of commissions and laws. They were counting windows. They were watching ladders stop short. They were seeing girls appear and disappear. They were hearing the impact. The fire lasted only about half an hour, and that is another fact that feels impossible when measured against the damage it did. The AFL-CIO's historical summary notes that in a half hour, the fire was over and 146 of roughly 500 workers were dead. Half an hour is a short errand. Half an hour is a meal. Half an hour is a walk through a neighbourhood. At Triangle, half an hour was enough time to expose an entire system and end 146 lives. When the jumping stopped, the street did not become normal again. It could not. Bodies lay on the pavement. Some were covered. Some were not yet identified. People searched faces. Firefighters and police moved through the aftermath. Survivors stood in shock, coughing, burned, injured, or simply unable to speak. Families had not yet arrived in full, but soon they would. Mothers and fathers would come looking for daughters. Brothers would come looking for sisters. Friends would search for friends. Some would go from hospital to hospital. Others would be sent to the morgue. The public part of the disaster, the windows and the crowd, would give way to the private part, the naming of the dead. But before the names came, there was the building itself still standing. That is an image worth holding because it tells us something harsh. The ash building survived. Its walls remained. The so-called fireproof structure had done what that term sometimes meant in the narrow language of the time. The building itself did not collapse into ashes. But inside it, workers had died because the rooms, contents, exits and rescue plans had not protected human life. A building can be fireproof and still be deadly. That lesson would matter enormously in the years that followed, because it forced reformers to ask better questions. Not only will the structure stand, but can people get out? Not only are there exits on a plan, but are they unlocked, clear, wide enough, and usable by a crowd? Not only is there a fire escape, but will it hold? Not only is there a hose, but does water flow through it? Not only does a workplace produce goods efficiently, but does it value the lives that make production possible? The windows made those questions public. The ladders made the city's limits visible. The crowd made the disaster impossible to hide. If the workers had died unseen inside a closed industrial building far from witnesses, the fire would still have been terrible, but it might not have entered public memory with the same force. What happened at Triangle happened in front of New York. It turned spectators into witnesses and witnesses into pressure. Newspapers printed the scenes. Families mourned in public. Labour organisers spoke with renewed urgency. Reformers pointed to the windows and asked what kind of city allowed workers to face such choices. The fire did not create the labour movement, and it did not create concern for workplace safety from nothing, but it gave those movements a set of images that could not be dismissed as exaggeration. I keep returning to one simple fact. The people at the windows were at work. That is all. They were not soldiers. They were not rescuers. They were not people who had chosen a profession known for mortal risk. They were garment workers making blouses. Their workplace should not have required courage in the face of death. It should have required skill, speed, patience, and a fair day's labour, not the decision of whether to jump from a window because the room behind them had become unlivable. The scandal of Triangle is not only that people died. People have always died in fires. The scandal is that they died in ways made likely by rules, habits, and choices that benefited others until the cost became visible. As the smoke thinned and the last flames were brought under control, the crowd remained below, changed by what it had seen. Some people could not leave. Some left because they could not bear to stay. The sidewalks and street near Washington Place held evidence that no one could explain away with language about unfortunate accidents or unforeseeable tragedy. The ladders had not reached. The nets had not saved. The exits had not served. The windows had become the last doors, and now the city had to decide what to do with that knowledge. In the hours that followed, grief moved through tenements, hospitals, police stations, newspaper offices, union halls, and the homes of families waiting for someone who would not come back. The dead had to be identified. The injured had to be treated. The owners had to answer questions. Officials had to speak. Reporters had to write. Ministers and rabbis had to prepare words for families whose loss was too large for words. The crowd below had seen the disaster, but seeing was only the beginning. The next struggle would be over meaning, blame, law, memory, and whether the deaths of these workers would be treated as the price of industry or as proof that industry had to be forced to change. After the fire, the city did not become quiet. That is one of the things people sometimes imagine about disaster, that after the terrible noise comes silence, as if grief itself lowers a blanket over everything. But New York did not fall silent after Triangle. It shook, it shouted, it searched, it argued, it wept in public and in crowded tenement rooms. It filled morgues, union halls, churches, synagogues, newspaper columns, courtrooms and sidewalks with the same question asked in different languages by people who did not all agree about politics, but who knew that something unforgivable had happened. The fire had lasted only about half an hour, but it left behind a city that could not simply sweep the pavement, reopen the doors, and go on as before. The dead had names, the dead had families, the dead had wages that would not come home, the dead had hands that had been sewing only minutes before the building turned against them. And now the living had to decide whether those deaths would be treated as a terrible accident or as evidence. The first task was identification, and there is something almost unbearable about the cold practicality of that word. Identification sounds orderly. It sounds administrative. It belongs to forms, lists, numbers, officials, and record books. But for the families of Triangle, identification meant walking into places no parent should have to enter and looking for a daughter, a sister, a wife, a cousin, a friend. It meant recognizing a ring, a shoe, a piece of clothing, a body altered by fire or falling or smoke. It meant standing in a crowd of other families who were doing the same thing and knowing that someone's search would end with recognition, and someone else's would continue into the next room. The city had death lists to compile. Families had lives to confirm as ended. Those are not the same task. One belongs to the public record. The other belongs to the private breaking of the heart. In the days after March 25th, 1911, grief moved through immigrant New York with a force that officials could not contain inside official language. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union proposed a day of mourning, and churches and synagogues filled before the grief spilled into the streets. Cornell's Triangle Fire Archive describes the weeks after the fire as a time when the city identified the dead, sorted their belongings, gathered in places of worship, and then gathered publicly in protest and mourning. That public grief mattered because the people who died had spent their working lives almost unseen by the city that depended on them. They had made clothing for a modern America that liked the finished blouse much more than it liked looking at the conditions behind it. In death, they became visible in a way they had not been allowed to be in life. The funeral procession on April 5th became one of the great public scenes of grief in New York's history. More than 100,000 people joined the procession up Fifth Avenue, and another 400,000 watched from the sidewalks and windows as the city mourned the unidentified victims and through them, all the dead of Triangle. It rained that day, and the rain matters, not in a symbolic way that needs to be dressed up, but in the ordinary bodily way weather always matters. People stood in wet clothes. Banners grew heavy, shoes soaked through. The crowd did not leave. That is what gives the day its weight. It was not a comfortable demonstration. It was not a convenient expression of sadness squeezed between other errands. It was hours of bodies standing together in bad weather because leaving would have felt like accepting too little. Imagine that procession moving through the city, workers walking beside reformers, immigrant families beside middle-class women who had come through the settlement houses and reform organizations, union banners, black coats, wet hats, faces at windows, people who had never entered a garment factory watching the grief of those who had worked in them. The procession said something the official world had not yet found language for. It said these girls were not disposable. It said their deaths belonged not only to their families, but to the city. It said that if New York could be dressed by immigrant labour, fed by immigrant labour, built by immigrant labour, and cleaned by immigrant labour, then New York could not pretend that immigrant deaths were a private sorrow belonging only to crowded neighbourhoods downtown. There was anger inside that mourning, and the anger did not wait politely to be invited. Workers flocked to union headquarters to give testimony, support organising, and demand that the Triangle owners, Max Blank and Isaac Harris, be brought to trial. That detail is important because grief can be made passive if we tell it badly. We picture people crying, and they did cry. We picture mothers collapsing, and some surely did. But grief also organised. It asked who had locked doors. It asked why the ladders did not reach. It asked why scraps had been allowed to pile up. It asked why workers had fought for better conditions before the fire, and still found themselves in rooms where escape depended on luck. The public did not only want sympathy, it wanted an answer. A few days before the funeral procession, thousands gathered at the Metropolitan Opera House for a mass meeting about the fire. It was a strange and revealing room, filled with wealthy reformers, public figures, clergy, union people, and workers whose lives were much closer to the danger being discussed. Out of that meeting came a committee on safety, which became a force for collecting information and pushing political action. But the meeting also revealed the tension between charity and justice. Some people wanted relief for families. That was needed. Rent still had to be paid. Burial costs had to be met. Children still needed food. But others, especially workers and labour organisers, understood that charity after death was not enough. A few dollars for a grieving family did not unlock a factory door. A memorial speech did not widen a stairway. Sympathy did not stop the next fire. Rose Schneiderman understood that with a clarity that cut through the room. She was a labour organiser, a small woman with a voice people remembered, and at the memorial meeting she spoke not as someone asking politely for pity, but as someone naming the failure of a society that had treated workers' lives as cheap. Cornell preserves her speech under the title "We Have Found You Wanting," and in it she warned that working people had been offered charity after a tragedy, while the law pressed down on them when they protested unbearable conditions. I do not want to turn her into a decorative figure in the story, because she was doing something sharper than decoration. She was refusing the comfort of grief without responsibility. She was saying that if the public wanted to mourn these women honestly, it had to stop congratulating itself for compassion and start asking why workers had been left to save themselves. That was the deeper conflict after Triangle. Was the disaster a matter of individual guilt, public shame, industrial habit, weak law, or all of these at once? The city wanted punishment. That is natural. When people die in a way that feels preventable, the mind looks for a person to stand in the place of the whole system. Blank and Harris were the obvious men. They owned the factory. They had profited from the labour. Their company had controlled the doors, the pace, the rules, the rooms. They had been warned by strikes and public agitation that garment workers wanted safer conditions. To many New Yorkers, the moral case seemed simple. The owners should answer for the dead. The legal case was not simple in the same way, and that difference between moral certainty and legal proof would become one of the most painful parts of the aftermath. On April 11th, 1911, a grand jury indicted Harrison Blank on 7 counts of manslaughter in the second degree under a section of the Labour Code requiring that doors not be locked during working hours. The prosecution's argument centred on the locked doors, especially the Washington Place stairway door on the 9th floor, where many workers had tried to escape. Worker after worker testified that they could not open the door to the stairway that might have saved them, while the Green Street stairs were engulfed by fire. The courtroom became, in effect, a second kind of factory floor, with the arrangement of doors, stairs, keys, routes and rules examined under pressure. Picture the witnesses entering that courtroom. Survivors who had escaped smoke and flame now had to sit before lawyers and judges and turn terror into testimony. That is not easy. Memory after disaster does not behave like a clean diagram. A person remembers heat, pressure, a face, a hand, a door, a sound. Lawyers want sequence. They want certainty. Which door? What time? Who stood where? How do you know it was locked? Did you try the knob? Could it have been jammed by the crowd? Did you see the owners? Did they know? Legal truth is built through questions that can feel almost cruel when they are aimed at people who are still carrying the fire inside them. But the law asks those questions because the law has its own standards, and those standards do not always match grief's demand. The defense attorney Max Stoyer was skilled. That too must be said plainly. He did not need to prove that the factory was safe in any broad moral sense. He did not need to prove that the workers had not died terribly. He did not need to prove that the doors had never been locked at Triangle. He needed to create doubt about whether Blank and Harris knew, at the time of the fire, that the specific door in question was locked. Cornell's account states that the juror's task was to decide whether the owners knew the doors were locked when the fire occurred. This is where the public's anger and the court's logic began to separate. The crowd outside could look at the dead and say the owners were responsible. The jury had to look at the evidence and answer a narrower question. On December 27th, after a trial that had begun 23 days earlier, the jury acquitted Blank and Harris. The verdict landed like a second blow. For grieving families and for much of the public, it felt as if the law had walked up to the locked door, touched the handle, and then stepped away. People had watched girls fall from windows. They had buried daughters. They had heard survivor testimony. They had read about doors and stairways and fire escapes. And now the men at the top of the business were legally free of criminal guilt. This is one of those moments when history forces us to understand that acquittal is not the same as innocence in the moral imagination. The court had not said the factory system was just. It had not said the deaths were acceptable. It had said that, under the law and the proof presented, the owners could not be convicted of manslaughter. To the families, that distinction may have felt almost obscene. I want you to think about the mothers and fathers hearing that verdict. Not as a headline, but as a sound in the room. They had already lost the person who left home for work and never returned. They had already endured identification, funeral, questions, newspaper attention, public pity. Perhaps they had imagined that the trial would give some shape to the loss, some official acknowledgement that what happened was not merely fate, and then acquittal. The law did not hand them their daughters back. It did not even hand them the satisfaction of punishment. It left them with the kind of anger that has nowhere easy to go. There were civil suits later, but they offered no true repair. 23 individual civil suits were brought in 1911, and on March 11, 1914, Blank and Harris settled by paying $75 per life lost. $75. It is a number that almost refuses to be understood because it turns a person into an amount so small that the mind rejects it. No sum could have been enough, of course. Money cannot measure a daughter. But some numbers insult the wound they claim to address. The Census Bureau's history notes that the owner's insurance paid them far more for business losses than families received in those settlements, which only sharpened public outrage over how property and human life were valued. The imbalance was hard to miss. The dead workers had been paid little in life and valued cheaply in death, while the machinery of business found ways to protect itself. And yet, this is where the story does not simply collapse into despair. Because the city refused to forget, and refusal matters. The criminal trial did not give many people the justice they wanted, but the public anger did not vanish after the verdict. It moved into politics, investigations, committees, inspections, laws, and organising. This is the part of history that is easy to understate because legislation does not have the immediate drama of a courtroom or a funeral. A law passed in Albany does not pierce the heart the way a mother searching a morgue does. But law is one of the ways grief becomes structure. It is one of the ways the dead continue to speak after the crowd has gone home. The Committee on Safety urged state action, and reformers pushed Albany to investigate the conditions under which manufacturing was being carried on. On June 30th, 1911, New York created the Factory Investigating Commission, led by figures including Robert Wagner and Al Smith, with broad powers to examine fire hazards, sanitation, factory inspection, tenement manufacturing, occupational disease, and other dangers facing workers. That scope matters. The Commission did not only ask whether another triangle could burn, it asked what industrial work was doing to bodies every day, even when there was no fire. It treated the fire not as an isolated horror, but as a doorway into the larger world of unsafe work. Frances Perkins was part of this movement, and her presence links the street outside Triangle to the future of American labour policy. She had witnessed the fire, then helped turn grief into organised reform through the Committee on Safety, and later through investigations and public work. The Department of Labour's historical account notes that Perkins testified, conducted investigations, and took commissioners on factory visits, and that she later carried lessons from this era into national labour policy as Secretary of Labour. She understood that moral shock had to be disciplined into action, or it would fade. People can be horrified for a week and then return to habit. Perkins and others worked to prevent that return. The Commission's work was enormous for its time. It visited factories, it heard testimony, it gathered evidence. It looked at crowded rooms, locked exits, bad ventilation, poisonous substances, long hours, poor sanitation, weak inspection, and the daily risks that did not make headlines because they killed slowly or injured quietly. The Department of Labour describes it as the most massive worker safety and health investigation any state had yet undertaken. That is what Triangle forced open. The fire made it politically possible to look where industry preferred not to be seen. It made inspectors, lawmakers, and citizens ask questions that workers had already been asking for years. There were city-level changes too. In October 1911, New York City created a Bureau of Fire Prevention, meant to clarify responsibility for inspections, fire codes, and enforcement. In the following years, changes to the municipal building code required safety devices such as fire alarms, extinguishers, hoses, improved fireproofing, and safer stairwells, and smoking in factories was eventually prohibited by 1916. These details may sound technical, but technical details are where survival often lives. A door opening outward is technical until a crowd presses against it. A fire alarm is technical until smoke moves faster than a shout. An extinguisher is technical until a scrap bin catches. A stairwell standard is technical until 300 bodies need the same path down. The anger also exposed the weakness of relying on owners to do the right thing without pressure. Cornell's investigation and trial account notes that only days after the fire, the owner's new factory premises were found lacking fireproof conditions, fire escapes, and adequate exits. In 1913, Max Blanc was charged with locking a factory door during working hours and fined $20, with the judge apologising for imposing the fine. That small fine is almost too revealing, $20 for a locked door after Triangle. It shows why reformers did not simply ask for better intentions. Good intentions were not enforceable. Apologies did not save workers. Warnings did not change enough. Safety had to be built into law, inspection, penalties, and public expectation. This is not to say the reforms came easily or completely. Employers resisted. Courts questioned protective laws. Politicians balanced public outrage against business pressure. Some reformers wanted laws. Some labour leaders worried that laws without strong unions would be weakly enforced. Workers themselves knew that a statute on paper could mean little if no inspector came, if inspectors were corrupt, if fines were low, if bosses found ways around the rules. The aftermath of Triangle was not a fairy tale where a bad thing happened and then everyone became wise. It was a struggle. It was paperwork, lobbying, speeches, hearings, reports, compromises, inspections, and continued organising. It was slow because power rarely gives up convenience quickly. But something had shifted. The fire had changed what could be said in public. Before Triangle, unsafe factory conditions could be dismissed as the complaint of agitators, radicals, immigrants, or women who did not understand business. After Triangle, the city had seen what those conditions meant. It had seen the windows. It had seen the ladders fail. It had watched the procession. It had heard the trial. It had felt the anger of acquittal. The memory became a tool. Reformers could point to Triangle and say, "This is what happens when safety is left to private calculation." Workers could point to Triangle and say, "This is why we organise." Legislators could point to Triangle and say, "This is why government must act before the next funeral." And the families carried something different, something no reform could fully touch. Public memory is not the same as private grief. A city can build laws from a tragedy, but a mother still has an empty place at the table. A union can strengthen after a fire, but a sister still remembers the voice that is gone. A name can be printed on a memorial list, but the person behind it had a bed, a coat, a favourite food, a way of laughing, a habit of walking quickly or slowly, a private thought about the future that no one else can recover. History needs the public consequences, but it must not let consequences replace the people. As the trial ended and the reform movement gathered force, the Triangle factory became more than a site of death. It became an argument the country would keep having with itself. What is an employer responsible for? What is the state allowed, even obligated, to regulate? How much risk can be placed on workers in the name of profit? Who is believed when workers say a workplace is dangerous? How much does a poor immigrant girl's life count under law? These questions did not disappear with the acquittal. They grew sharper because of it. The courtroom had disappointed many people, but the disappointment itself fed the demand for change. The city refused to forget because forgetting would have been another kind of permission. To forget would have meant letting the locked door become just an unfortunate detail. To forget would have meant allowing the fire escape to collapse into the past without consequence. To forget would have meant treating the girls at the windows as a sad scene rather than as evidence of a system that had to be remade. The anger after Triangle was not clean or simple, but it was useful because it would not stay in the room assigned to mourning. It moved outward. It found committees. It found legislators. It found inspectors. It found union halls. It found Frances Perkins and Rose Schneiderman and thousands of workers who had already known the truth in their own bodies. And so the story begins to turn from death toward the long, difficult work of changing the conditions that made death so likely. Not all at once, not perfectly, not with the satisfaction the families deserved. But through fire codes, labour laws, factory inspections, limits on hours, stronger unions, public pressure, and a new understanding that workplace safety was not a private favour granted by good employers, but a public responsibility. The trial had asked whether two men could be found guilty under a narrow law. The larger question waiting beyond the courtroom was whether America would keep allowing workplaces to be built around locked doors, short ladders, weak exits, and cheap lives. And it is there, in the laws and reforms that followed, that the fire's longest shadow begins to stretch across the American workplace. The change did not arrive like a clean sunrise. That is important to understand. After Triangle, America did not wake up the next morning as a country where every factory door opened freely, every stairway was wide enough, every fire escape was strong, every employer was careful, and every worker was protected by law. History almost never moves that neatly. The dead were buried, the trial ended in disappointment for many families, the owners walked free of criminal conviction, and the garment industry did not suddenly become gentle. Machines still ran, workers still crowded into rooms, young women still rose early in tenements and walked toward factories because rent still had to be paid and food still had to be bought. But something had shifted in the public mind. A door that had once looked like a private matter between owner and worker now looked like a public danger. A stairway that had once been a building detail now looked like a question of life and death. A factory inspection that had once seemed like government interference now looked to many people like the difference between a wage and a funeral. That is the first real change Triangle made. It changed what people were willing to call private. Before the fire, many factory conditions were treated as internal business matters. If a room was crowded, that was the employer's room. If workers were searched, that was the employer's rule. If exits were watched or locked, that was part of the employer's effort to prevent theft. If scraps gathered beneath tables, that was a housekeeping problem. If wages were low, hours long, air bad and stairways inadequate, those were problems workers might complain about, unions might protest, and reformers might mention in reports. But they did not yet command the full attention of the city. Triangle dragged those private arrangements into public daylight. It showed that when a workplace failed, the consequences did not stay inside the workplace. They fell into the street. They landed in front of witnesses. They entered homes, hospitals, morgues, cemeteries, newspapers, courtrooms, and eventually the law. The New York Factory Investigating Commission became one of the major instruments of that change. Created after the fire, it was given broad authority to examine the conditions under which manufacturing was carried on, including fire hazards, unsafe and unsanitary workplaces, occupational disease, tenement manufacturing, and the effectiveness of factory inspection. The Department of Labour describes the Commission as having unusual powers for the time, including the power to summon witnesses under oath, and as one of the most significant worker safety investigations any state had yet undertaken. That matters because the Commission did not treat Triangle as a freak event. It treated the fire as evidence of a much larger industrial world that needed to be opened, examined, measured, and forced to answer questions it had avoided for years. Picture those investigators walking into factories after Triangle, not as workers trying to keep their jobs, not as buyers admiring finished clothing, not as owners counting orders, as people looking for danger. That is a different way of seeing a room. Where a manufacturer might see productive density, an investigator might see blocked aisles. Where a foreman might see efficient rows of machines, an investigator might see bodies with too little space to flee. Where an owner might see a door controlled for discipline, an investigator might see a death sentence waiting for smoke. Where a bookkeeper might see ordinary expenses, an investigator might ask why fireproofing, alarms, extinguishers, stairways, and clear exits had been treated as costs to avoid. The same room can look different depending on what you believe matters most. In the years after Triangle, New York passed a series of laws that transformed factory regulation. They addressed fire prevention, building exits, fire drills, sanitation, ventilation, machinery safeguards, working hours, and factory inspection. Cornell's Triangle Fire Archive explains that the legislative response after the fire grew out of the Progressive Era reform movement, when many Americans were increasingly concerned about unregulated economic development, long hours, low wages, dangerous factories, and the lack of a social safety net for the poor. Triangle did not create that concern from nothing. It gave it a body. It gave it 146 bodies. It gave reformers a story no one could dismiss as theory. This is one of the hardest things to say plainly, but it has to be said. American workplace safety advanced because people died in front of witnesses. That is not because no one had warned of danger before. Workers had warned, unions had warned, reformers had warned. The 1909 shirtwaist strike had already revealed how bitter and serious the conflict over garment work had become. The International Ladies Garment Workers Union had been active in exposing hazardous conditions and pushing for better standards even before the fire. Cornell notes that the union helped monitor and report dangerous conditions in New York garment factories and participated in efforts such as the Joint Board of Sanitary Control. The voices were there before the flames. The tragedy was that those voices did not carry enough power until the smoke made the danger visible to people who had not wanted to listen. That is why Triangle changed American work in two ways at once. It changed laws and it changed credibility. After Triangle, when workers said a door was locked, the public had a reason to believe them. When unions said factory conditions were dangerous, the accusation carried the weight of Washington Place. When reformers demanded inspections, they could point not only to reports but to windows, ladders, bodies, and a funeral procession that had filled the city. A bad workplace was no longer only a matter of individual hardship. It became a threat to public morality. It became something the state could claim authority over. That idea seems ordinary now, but it was not ordinary then. The belief that government had both the right and the duty to regulate workplace safety had to be argued into existence against employers who called it interference, judges who worried about property rights, and politicians who feared business backlash. Think about the simple fire drill. Today it can feel like an interruption, the kind of thing people grumble about in offices, schools, warehouses, and apartment buildings. A bell rings, people stand up, someone sighs. You walk down the stairs, wait outside, and return to whatever you were doing. It feels almost too routine to matter, but routine is the point. A fire drill teaches the body before panic arrives. It turns escape from a question into a habit. It makes people practice the path while the air is clear and no one is screaming. The workers at Triangle did not have that kind of practiced protection. They had to improvise inside smoke. After the fire, reformers understood that safety could not depend on people inventing escape during disaster. It had to be rehearsed before disaster, written into the ordinary day so deeply that the body could follow it when the mind was afraid. Doors change too, not all at once and not everywhere, but in the logic of safety. A door in a workplace had to be understood first as an exit, not as a tool of discipline. It had to open outward. It had to remain unlocked during working hours. It had to be clear. It had to be more than a line on a plan. This is the kind of reform that can sound small until you remember the 9th floor. A door opening the wrong way is not a small matter when a crowd presses against it. A locked door is not a small matter when smoke is behind you. A blocked stair is not a small matter when the elevator can no longer come. Triangle taught America that safety lives in design before it appears in heroism. The same was true of fire escapes and ladders. The city had grown tall, but rescue had not reached high enough. Fire escapes could not merely exist. They had to be strong enough, accessible enough, and placed where people could actually use them. Firefighters could be brave and still be defeated by equipment that did not match the height of the building. That is another lesson Triangle left behind. Courage is not an adequate safety system. A brave firefighter below a window cannot make a short ladder taller by wanting it. A worker cannot make a weak fire escape stronger by trusting it. Rescue requires preparation, money, engineering, enforcement and imagination before the emergency begins. The laws that followed also asked questions about the slower harms of industrial work. Fire was dramatic, but unsafe labour was not only about fire, it was about air, light, heat, dust, chemicals, machinery, fatigue, and the number of hours a body could be driven before damage became normal. The Factory Investigating Commission examined occupational diseases and sanitation as well as fire hazards, which meant it looked beyond the spectacular disaster toward the everyday conditions that injured people quietly. This broadened the meaning of workplace safety. A safe workplace was not only one that did not burn, it was one that did not grind workers down invisibly while remaining legally acceptable. This shift mattered especially for women and immigrant workers. The Triangle dead were mostly young women and girls, many of them Jewish and Italian immigrants, and that fact gave the disaster a particular emotional force in the city. Cornell's account notes that 146 of the company's roughly 500 employees died, leaving survivors to relive the terrible moments of the fire. But the reforms that followed did not matter only because the victims were sympathetic. They mattered because the victims had belonged to groups often dismissed by power. Poor immigrant women were easy to ignore in life. Triangle made their workplace central to the future of American labor law. It forced the country to confront the fact that the people least protected by status were often the people most exposed to danger. Frances Perkins carried that lesson farther than almost anyone. She had witnessed the Triangle Fire as a young reformer, and the memory stayed with her through a lifetime of work. She later became Secretary of Labor under Franklin D. Roosevelt, the first woman to serve in a presidential cabinet and helped shape New Deal labor policy. It would be too simple to say every later reform came directly from Triangle, but Triangle was part of the moral formation of people like Perkins, who believed that government could not stand aside while workers were sacrificed to private profit. The fire became one of the experiences that linked progressive-era reform to the broader 20th century labor state. A witness on the street became a policymaker in Washington. A factory fire became part of the long road toward unemployment insurance. Minimum wage laws, limits on hours, and a federal government more willing to involve itself in the conditions of work. There is a line that runs from the windows of the Ash Building to the safety signs we ignore today. Not a straight line, not a perfect line, but a real one. Exit signs, occupancy limits, fire doors, sprinklers, stairwell lighting, regular inspections, fire drills, workplace injury rules, machines guarded so a hand cannot be drawn in as easily. Regulations requiring employers to think about the worker not only while she produces, but while she escapes, breathes, lifts, cuts, stands, and survives. None of these things arrived only because of Triangle, but Triangle gave them urgency. It became part of the argument that a workplace is not safe simply because workers continue entering it. People enter dangerous places every day when poverty gives them no better choice. That may be the deepest lesson of all. A job is not proof of consent to danger. When people ask why the Triangle workers stayed, or why workers anywhere remain in unsafe jobs, they're asking from a place of comfort if they imagine leaving is easy. Work is tied to rent, food, immigration status, family duty, language, debt, and fear. A young woman in 1911 might know a door was often locked and still return on Monday because the wage mattered. A man in a dangerous mine might know the roof was unstable and still go underground because children needed supper. A warehouse worker today might know the pace is punishing and still show up because health insurance depends on the job. Triangle changed American work because it challenged the convenient idea that if a worker accepts a job, all the conditions of that job become acceptable. The public outrage after Triangle helped push the idea that there must be a floor beneath which work could not legally fall. Not a floor of comfort, not a guarantee of ease, but a basic floor of exits, air, sanitation, reasonable hours, machinery safeguards, and the right to survive the day. That idea sounds modest until you realise how much of industrial history had operated without it. Employers had often treated workers as responsible for their own risk while controlling the very conditions that made risk unavoidable. Triangle exposed that contradiction. If the owner controls the door, the worker cannot be fully responsible for escaping through it. If the owner controls the room, the aisles, the pace, the scrap disposal, and the inspection routine, then safety cannot be placed entirely on the person sitting at the machine. There is also a change in memory, and memory has its own kind of power. Every year, people return to the Triangle story not because the facts are unknown, but because the facts still ask something of us. The building still stands, now known as the Brown Building, part of New York University, and its survival creates a strange tension. Students pass by. City life continues. The street is no longer filled with bodies and smoke. The windows are windows again. But memory remains attached to the place, and memory says that ordinary buildings can hold extraordinary obligations. A site of work can become a site of mourning. A workplace can become a warning. I want you to think about an exit sign near you, wherever you are. Maybe there is one in your hallway, your office, your school, your apartment building, your local store. It is easy to see it as background, just another glowing object in a modern room. But that little sign belongs to a long history of people learning, through terrible experience, that escape cannot be left to chance. It belongs to workers who died before the law caught up. It belongs to reformers who sat through hearings and wrote reports. It belongs to inspectors who were given authority because someone finally understood that voluntary safety was not enough. It belongs to unions that insisted workers should not have to choose between a paycheck and a survivable workplace. It belongs in part to the girls at Triangle. Still, we should not make the ending too neat. Triangle did not permanently solve workplace danger in America. Fires still happened, industrial accidents continued, employers still resisted regulation. Workers still had to organise, strike, sue, testify, and sometimes die before the public paid attention. Even today, unsafe work has not vanished. It has changed shape. It may appear in warehouses where speed is measured by scanners, meatpacking plants where injury becomes routine, construction sites where corners are cut, kitchens where heat and pressure go unseen, or factories far from the consumer whose purchases depend on the invisible labour. Triangle remains relevant because the basic question remains alive. How much of another person's risk are we willing not to see in exchange for cheaper goods, faster service, and convenient distance from the conditions of production? The shirtwaist itself has passed out of ordinary fashion. Most people no longer use the word. But the system that produced it, the system that separates the clean finished object from the difficult conditions behind it, is still recognisable. We still buy things without knowing who made them. We still benefit from labour we never meet. We still trust that someone somewhere has made the workplace safe enough. Triangle asks us not to trust too easily. It asks us to remember that safety is built, enforced, maintained, and defended. It asks us to remember that regulations often look burdensome until you imagine their absence from inside a burning room. There is a quiet dignity in the fact that the Triangle workers changed America without intending to. They did not set out to become martyrs. They did not gather that Saturday to make a statement about labour law. They were working. That is all. Their lives were ordinary in the way most lives are ordinary, filled with errands, wages, family arguments, tired mornings, small pleasures and plans no one wrote down. The country changed around the fact of their deaths, because witnesses, organisers, reformers and grieving families refused to let those deaths be reduced to bad luck. That refusal is part of the legacy. The fire mattered because people made it matter. And there is one more thing, something simple, almost too simple, but maybe it is the thing worth carrying. A workplace is a moral space, not only an economic space, not only a place where labour is exchanged for wages. It is a room where human beings spend the hours of their lives. That means the arrangement of that room is never neutral. The width of the aisle, the lock on the door, the strength of the fire escape, the amount of dust in the air, the speed demanded by the machine, the respect given to a complaint, the seriousness of an inspection, all of it says something about how a society values the people who work. Triangle forced America to read that message in smoke. So when we say the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire changed American work forever, we do not mean it ended suffering in the workplace. We mean it changed the argument. It made it harder to claim that safety was a private luxury. It helped make factory inspection a public duty. It strengthened the demand for labour laws. It gave unions and reformers a memory sharp enough to cut through indifference. It helped teach Americans that behind every product stands a person, and behind every person should stand a law strong enough to protect her, when profit would rather look away. The machines in the Triangle factory stopped that afternoon, but the questions they left behind kept moving, through Albany, through Washington, through every workplace where a door now has to open, where a drill has to be practiced, where a ladder has to reach, where a worker has the right to expect that the end of the workday will mean going home alive.